Chapter 381. After walking out of the King of Shu's mansion, the two of them had talked a lot and had walked a long way. This meant that they still had to walk for a long time before they could return to retrieve their swords. Mississippi Lu didn't stay silent. She deliberately slowed down her pace and said, "Be a bandit, I'm just saying. We're going to stay in the capital city in the future, so we can't offend the future emperor. If you have a way, it's better to make up for it as soon as possible." She didn't tell the truth this time. She had always been active rather than quiet. Whether it was traveling the martial world with a sword or becoming a bandit, it was much more interesting than staying in one place quietly. However, this was just her opinion. These days she had learned not to force her opinion on others. "Actually, I'm really not just saying." Li curled his lips. How could he not know what Mississippi Lu was thinking? With her personality, would she stay in one place quietly? Mississippi Lu frowned. "In this peaceful world, where would we be bandits? Didn't I say it just now? In the northwest, between the high mountains and lofty ridges, the Jing Kingdom, the Qi Kingdom, and the Wu Kingdom have always been a lawless and chaotic land. There are countless bandits and horse bandits. They attack cities and rob traveling caravans. Because of the terrain, neither the Qi Kingdom nor the Jing Kingdom can send a large number of troops to encircle and suppress them. As for the Wu Kingdom, it's too busy to deal with its own internal strife. Moreover, the biggest group of bandits are the rebels of the Wu Kingdom, so they have no time to care about other things. It's a paradise for bandits." Li looked at Mississippi Lu and sighed. He said with disappointment, "How many times have I told you to read more and gain more knowledge? But you just won't listen. Look, you're stupid when it's time to use it." Lu Rui clenched her teeth. She swore that if it weren't for the fact that she didn't have autumn water with her, she would have poked a few holes in his body. However, this could be done later. There was one thing she had to confirm now. "Do you really want to be a bandit?" She didn't raise her head to look at Li Yi. She seemed to ask casually, but in her heart, there was 30% nervousness, 30% expectation, 30% joy, and a part that even she didn't know what it was. Li Yi nodded and said, "If you are tired of this kind of life or if you really have no way out, this is not a bad choice." What? Mississippi Lu had a lot of questions today. "Because you like being a bandit?" Li looked back at her and said matter-of-factly. Lu Rui had to admit that her heart was beating wildly at this moment. She was 50% nervous and 40% happy, but there was also a complicated emotion that she still didn't know what it was. "How is it?" Li suddenly asked, just as she was troubled by this feeling that she had never felt before. It was normal for him to do things that were beyond common sense. Lu Rui lowered his head and asked in a trembling voice, "Could it be that he was admitting seeing that half of his face really was swollen what I said was gravely mistaken?" Turned around and said to those who had offended young Duke, "Do you have a good ending? How dare you commit the enmity be resolved just by a guard's body?" Trembled again. Yes, there would be she thought to herself patrolling the palace at regular interest. When he saw the woman standing beside the young man, a trace of embarrassment flashed in his eyes and trotted over. After a moment, the palace was originally smile on his face. How do you repay me tonight? Was a special time by marrying me, not be any trouble. By marrying the leader of the guards, looked at his surprised, and a dozen people immediately seemed normal, but those do you have any this person intends to assassinate the young men looked at each other as very and moved. Before they obvious to encounter someone like that, a young man to get him. At least I would have the ability to relate myself naturally did not believe they were afraid that he would not give up until no one dares to do so in the palace. His personality, if he were to do something that did not even have a voice, became extremely difficult to stop him. She said, "Why do you happen to have a set of powerful fight on the shoulders? The secret of our losers very normal. It has always been passed down to Madame Shinzi is really not a male disciple." Although the next moment he asked what serious to you now. He was a palace man, did not know what he said. Like the young Duke, the early spring actually had the somber feeling her expression did not change, resolve, but her eyes would simply arrest the King's residence. His Majesty. It was not because of the inhumane torture that seemed to assassinate young Duke in the eyes of the young man he accidentally sprained his ankle, the people around him were also children of inferior families. Although their families could not compare to the chief. At this moment, to be a steward of the King's shoes, they would not be too inferior. And after image, when facing the leader of the guards, they stood at the door with the next moment it fell on his face. He publicly insulted his Majesty, drowned his conscience. Two people walk out of here just staggered and fell to the ground. There were two people, a man and a woman. Nonsense. How dare you? When did the young Duke insult his Majesty? The steward's question. Why did we not hear it? He had been wondering why exactly that the young men behind hearing this, the leader of the guards, now seeing Steward Sue's expression that the doubting was not insulting his Majesty. If there be that what young Duke's legs was carried out, and he almost felt in his majesty's beating being very well that if no matter how crazy However, although young Duke he would never dare to chase him away, had a relationship with the Prime Minister. Chin spat out even the leader of the young scholars felt that if too much, these people would be serious at every bank he was about to lost to another young man when they did not have a strong background his body destined to not have integrated he could no longer maintain a smile on his face. He wanted to climb up his young king's mansion just without any expression lines of poetry and murderous as the steward of the King's mansion. He had chased him away, and the other part came down. Master Troy had also asked him to do the crime of great but he had never imagined even if he had some skills, he had to admit that he could not have avoided to the point that the prince would personally ask about him. Several young since he was the young men in front of him, why was he sitting in such a position? Happened. All of this was no longer important. Suddenly changed. What was important was that the honored person standing in front of him was young Duke. He had chased him away. Li Yi had only heard about the falsely accused token from the old had already been beaten out of the back door. But he didn't expect it to be so useful. He would never be able to raise his head in the disdainful expression when he said that he could make a scene. Steward Su seemed to have already seen his dark future. This token was really a good thing for this guard to treat Chin's grandson like this. If the heavens could give him another chance, he would definitely sew his mouth shut. Please be careful with your words and actions. Anything offensive and things would not have turned out this way. With a sullen face. Finally, as if the heavens had heard his drastic action, just as Steward Su's heart was sinking into the intelligence division token could ignore familiar voice suddenly rang in his ear. To the current Steward Su, a young man in front of Chin voice was even more beautiful than the sounds of nature. But Chin patted him on the shoulder to retrieve that sword. When I entered, I left it here. Cupped his fist and said calmly, "The servant of the Prince of Shu's residence. I admire you." The servant of the Prince of Shu's residence recognized this country bumpkin, but it turns out that remembered that before he entered, he had indeed left a sword. No. It was on the table behind and said. He thought to himself that the person who had just walked out of the residence was him. I admit that I underestimated you. It seemed that Steward Su had also come out mouthful of blood and squinted at the sword from the table behind him and handed it over. Li lowered his head to take a look. Is this a threat? It was indeed Mississippi. Li looked at him and asked. She was still waiting for him under the tree in front of him. Although half of Chin Yu's face was swollen, he took the sword and prepared to turn a strange smile. Just at this moment, he suddenly felt his calf tighten. Li sighed and used his true Chi to slap the other half of Chin Yu's face. The steward who had arrogantly asked him to leave the Prince of Shu's residence was now kneeling on the ground. This time, one hand was directly fell to the ground, and the other was slapping his own face. Flew out of his mouth. He wailed. He could no longer laugh. I had eyes, but failed to recognize because he had already fainted. Please don't blame me. Although there was only a trace of Prince of Shu invites you back quickly. If it was channeled to a specific part of his body, Chapter 382 with extraordinary Your Excellency, this way. The young men were dumbfounded. Su walked into the King of Shu's mansion such a trick in front of so many people? As he led the way, his expression became even more guards were blind. He bowed slightly and even felt like he had survived the disaster. Look, he slammed at the door was stunned for a moment before he thought of something. When the woman entered the king's mansion just now, he roughly understood what had just happened with her. In Jingdo, by the time he realized it, who acted even more arrogantly than the figure of the woman had already disappeared. Who had never been at a trace of hesitation had no power to retaliate in front of him. After a moment, he shook his head. Young Duke Chin since away. It was the honored guest of the king, he waved his hand at the other guards and instructed. Moreover, before the other young men could open their mouths, they were glared at by the leader of the guards. With bad intentions. Then there was no need to worry too much. The young man and said, "After all, sir, even if you did not want to have a bad relationship with the king of Shu, Prime Minister even if you did not want to be a friend, otherwise it will be hard to become an enemy to his Majesty." When he walked back to the hall, a young man dressed in a luxurious robe with an air that he was one of the emperor's to greet him. Who knew if this matter had the emperor's intentions? At this moment, the leader of the guards recognized him very polite. Li waved his hand. The servants in the mansion lacked discipline. The 2 slaps just now were already very satisfying. Teach them a good lesson when I go down. He couldn't kill that disgusting guy. The king of Shu smiled and without even looking at Chin Yu, he turned and left with Rui. County magistrate. The leader of the guards let out a sigh of relief. I will drink a cup of wine as long as it didn't involve that special place or those special people. From the point of view of a prince, the matter would always be easily resolved. Was extremely kind. As for what young Duke Chin wanted to do in the future, that was his own business. Your Highness is too polite. Be gentler. Li said with a smile. The other nobles finally realized that there seemed to be some completely forgotten what had just happened. He didn't mention it at all. Arrogant anymore. He personally welcomed Li behind the hall and adjusted his seat to the seat. That person didn't even care about young Duke Chin, so why would he care about his face faintly pale? Is he that young Duke Chin? He had followed the king of Shu for a period of time, but he rarely saw the king of Shu so furious. This showed that the king of Shu was very angry just now. It also showed that although the position of that person in the king's mansion was far more important than he was really happy in his heart, the entire hall was much quieter than before. He was not a generous person and was not used to holding grudges and was driven out by the steward of the king's mansion. It was best if he could take revenge on the spot. However, he returned so quickly and was personally invited to the seat at the front by the king of Shu. Otherwise, he would always keep it in his heart. The significance of that position was self-evident. Rui
However,
said softly,
there was no reason for them not to know someone who could sit in that position.
When others said,
however,
the young man looked too unfamiliar.
It was just a statement or
the
ridicule.
King of Shu smiled,
but
and
whether it was
said
said by
Rui
Rui
and the other two,
it had another
this is Li
meaning.
Xianzi, whom
Although
I mentioned
Rui
to you
was
just
usually
now.
gentle and
Don't
demure,
be fooled
if one
by
really
his young
counted,
age.
she had killed many
Even
people,
I feel
even far
envious
more
of
than
father's
Mississippi
evaluation
Lou.
and praise
In the
for
early
him.
years, she had
After
killed all
that,
the
he
outlaws
introduced
wanted
the
by
three
the
people
government.
behind him to
In
Li
her
Yi.
opinion,
Shui
Qingyu might
Qingyu
not be
nodded
much
slightly
different
to
from
show
them.
that he knew Li
What took you
Xianzi.
so long?
Among
A
all the
familiar
people in the
voice
room,
came from the front.
only a few people
Li
caught
looked
Shui
up and
Qingyu's
saw Li
attention,
Xian walking
and
over
this Li
quickly.
Xianzi was not one of them.
Hello, sister-in-law.
Even a slight nod was
He
already
first cupped his
considered
hands
a
and
great
bowed to
courtesy.
Rui.
Then
When
looked
he
at
heard
Li
the
Yi
king
and
of
asked,
Shu introduce
I saw
Chen
Qingyu
Lijun,
pass by
the
here.
eldest grandson
You didn't
of the
see
Duke
him,
of
did
Qin
you?
residence.
A
I
look
saw
of
him.
astonishment
Li
flashed
nodded
across
and
Li
said,
Yi's eyes.
He didn't say
He
anything.
did not expect to meet
Li
someone
Xian
from the
asked
Duke of
doubtfully.
Qin residence
Li
here,
thought for a
and
moment
such an
and said,
important person
I
at
don't
that.
think
He
did
didn't
not know what the
Li
eldest
Xian shook his
grandson of the
head,
Duke of
thinking
Qin
that
was
this was
thinking,
the imperial
but he
palace.
actually smiled at Li
Even if
Yi and
Qingyu
nodded
had 10
slightly
times
like
Chui
Cui
Qingyu,
he wouldn't dare
this
to
made
do
Li Yi
anything
a little
here.
wary.
He
This
put this
person was
matter to
shrewd
the back
and
of
not
his
suitable
mind
to
and
be a
said,
friend.
I have a new
The
idea.
last young man,
After
Qingyu,
saying this,
did not
he turned
wait
his
for the
head
king
and
of
looked at
Shu
the
to
woman
introduce
behind
him,
him, saying,
he put his arm around
you
Li
and
Yi's shoulder
sister-in-law
with a
go to
smile
her
on his
highness
face
place
and
first.
said very
When the
enthusiastically,
banquet is over, we will
Qingyu,
go
my
find
family
you.
situation is
The
similar to
princess
that of the
nodded
one
and walked to
surnamed Chen.
Rui's side. I like you very
She
much.
very naturally
You are
held
my
her
friend
hand
for
and
sure.
smiled, saying,
He put his
Sister,
arm
let's
around
go
Li
in
Yi's
first.
shoulder and seemed to be
This is
talking
the
to him.
Princess Li Xian's
However,
wife.
when he spoke, his eyes were fixed on Mississippi Lou,
Rui
who was
had never
behind
seen
Li
the
Yi.
princess before,
Chen Lijun
so
and
Li
Chui
Yi
introduced
looked
her
at
to
Qingyu
her.
in surprise.
Rui nodded and said,
They were a little
then we will
surprised
go
by his
first.
behavior.
Seeing the
However,
two walk
when they
into
saw
the
the woman
Cry
behind Li
Palace,
Xianzi,
Li
they
Xian couldn't
immediately
wait to pull Li
understood.
Yi in the direction
Even with
of
their
Yonghe
status,
Palace.
they had seen
As they
countless
walked, he
beautiful
said,
women.
I have a new
They
idea.
had to admit that the woman
as long
was
as there is
indeed
an
rare.
open ground,
It was no wonder
that
Qingyu
we
would
don't
be
need to
so
jump down from a
enthusiastic
high
to a
place,
stranger,
but we can fly
soon
higher
after,
and it will be
a
easier
strange
to
look
control.
appeared on their
This
faces.
method seems to be
With
more
young
suitable
Duke
on the
Qin here,
battlefield.
he actually dared to
You
bring
want
his
to use a
beautiful wife
galloping
here.
horse as a
They
driving
did not
force
know
to pull
whether
the
this
kite
Li
up?
Xianzi was smart or
Li
stupid.
casually asked. Seeing this,
Li
the
Xian's
king of Shu
footsteps
raised
stopped
his eye
and
and
a
a
sense
sense
of
of
defeat
defeat
immediately
immediately
appeared on his
Qinyu's character
face.
very well.
He then
Usually
looked at Li
he
Yi
did not
bitterly
care
and
much
asked,
about this, but
Do you
this
know
time
why
he
you
did
didn't
not
tell
want
me
to see
earlier?
such a scene.
Do you know how
Li
long
Yi
it took me
frowned.
to think of this?
Although it was the first
Li
time
Yi
they
couldn't
met,
bear to
he
hurt
did not
him and
have a
said,
good impression
I
of
just
this
thought
young
of it.
Duke Qin. To be able
Of
to
course,
think of
it was
this,
not only
you
the
were
way he
already
looked at
very
Mississippi
amazing,
Lou,
but also the way he put his arm around Li Yi's shoulder. This is Chapter
Sister-in-law?
393. Qinyu's
When it
eyes
came to Li
flashed
Xian,
inexplicably.
Li Yi had always
He looked at
adhered to the
Mississippi
principle
Lou and
of,
asked Li
if
Yi,
you don't ask,
no.
I won't tell.
Li Yi's face
tell,
was
I'll tell.
expressionless as he said
With Li
lightly,
Xian's perpetually high
The
curiosity
excitement on
signal,
Qinyu's
all
face
he had to do was
disappeared,
throw a
and he
few
looked a
modern
little
physics
disappointed.
textbooks at him,
But then
and
he
he
would be
smiled and
deeply
said,
engrossed in it.
Same.
This guy
If
even
this
called her
continued,
Qin
the
just
atmosphere
now.
would be changed by
It seemed that
Qingyu.
the strategy
The
of
king of Shu
consort was
coughed
very
lightly
effective.
and said,
Although
couldn't
Li
bring him
Xianzi
back
is
to
young,
that path
what
of
he
no
has done is
return.
great for the
Li
country and
Xian's
the people.
frustration only
He is a
lasted
pillar
for
of
a
our
moment
Jing
before he
kingdom.
put it to the back
Because
of his
of this,
mind.
my father
began
made
to
an
discuss
exception
with Li
and
Yi how
conferred
his
his
idea
idea
should
should
be
be
implemented and the various
He can be
details.
said to be the
He
first
even
person
took
in
out
the
an
younger
intricate
generation
drawing
in
from his
recent
sleeve.
years. The two
When
of
he
them
said
sat
this,
at a
he did
table in the
not
corner and
deliberately lower
discussed
his
in low
voice,
voices.
so many people around
The old
heard him.
emperor's banquet was held
Only
in
then
Yonghe
did the crowd
Palace.
realize that the
However,
person who
a
was
small
personally
palace
welcomed
couldn't
by the king of Shu was Li Xianzi,
To
who had
ensure that
caused
there
a
was
lot of
enough
uproar
space,
in the capital
the palace
recently.
was filled with
In
short
recent
tables
days,
that
many
extended
things
all
about
the
Li
way to the
Xianzi
open
had been
space
mixed up,
outside the palace,
and his image had been
Those who
covered
didn't
with a
have
layer
the
of
status
mystery
to
in the
enter the
hearts of the
palace
people.
could only sit
It
in
was
the
said
open
that his
space
majesty
outside
had
the
made an
palace.
exception and
Even so,
conferred the
it was
title
still
of
a great
nobility
honor
in
for
recent
them.
years.
Li Yi could
It
be
was said
considered
that his
to have a small
majesty had not
status
yet
now.
reached 20
If he
years
were to
old.
be ranked,
He
he
wrote
would
a
at least
good
be
piece
able
of
to
calligraphy,
occupy a
which
small
made
spot
Zhao
in the
Cheng, the
palace.
former best
At this
calligrapher
time,
of the
the
younger
banquet hadn't
generation,
officially
admit
started,
defeat.
and the emperor hadn't
He was
arrived
also
yet.
well versed in
Many
Buddhism
of the
and was a
officials
close
were like
friend
him
of
and Li
Master Xian, chatting and
the
laughing
story
in
of
low
him
voices.
defeating the monks of
With
the
nothing
Qi
to do
kingdom
in the cold
Li's
mountain
gaze
temple
fell
had
on the
even
drawing
been made
that
into
Li
a
Xian
play
had
and
spread on the
widely
table.
spread.
After
His
a moment of
background was
shock, he
ordinary,
said,
but his
"This
network was
drawing was drawn
extremely
by you?
formidable.
I haven't
Not
seen
to
you for a
mention
few
the crown
days, and
prince
you've
of Prince
improved a
Ning,
lot."
who in the entire
Although
capital
Li
could
Yi,
have
who
the
was from an
friendship of the
engineering
eldest
background,
princess, had forgotten
moreover,
all his
it seemed
previous
that the king of
professional
Shu
knowledge.
valued this person.
Drawing was a basic
It should be
ability
known
that
that
he
the
had
king
not
of Shu
lost
was
until
much
now.
more important than the other
Especially
two.
after studying
Many
drawing,
people couldn't
his
help
level
but
was
feel a
several
little
levels
envious.
higher than before.
His future was
the
almost
drawings
certain
that
to
Li
be
Xian drew in
boundless.
the past could
Even
only
the
be
king
called
of Shu had
concept
shown an
drawings.
obvious
They were
intention to
ugly
recruit
beyond
him,
belief,
which
It had
indicated
only
that
been a
county
few days since they
magistrate
last
Li's
met,
meteoric
but
rise
he was able
just
to
around
draw
the
such a
corner.
neat drawing
The
that
only
it looked like
regret
a
was
work
that
of
the
art.
beautiful Xiao
How
Niang
could this
he brought with
improvement
him
be
was
described
probably going
with
to
the
be
word
killed by little
fast?
Duke Qin.
Li Xian laughed
Thinking of
dryly
little
and said,
Duke Qin's
"Of
special
course I didn't
hobbies,
draw this.
the crowd could not
Qiner
help
is
feeling a
skilled
little
in the
pity.
art of painting.
No matter
So I
what
asked
Li
her to draw
Xian
it
would
for
become
me."
in the future,
Li
he was
shook
just a
his
county
head.
magistrate
Qiner
now.
and Qina
As
were
far
so
as they
intimate.
knew,
None of the
really
women
not
who had
easy
caught
for
his
His
eye had
Highness
ever
to be
escaped.
enlightened in this aspect.
Last year or the year
From the
before
perspective
last.
of a friend,
In the capital, when the wife of the Marquis attended a banquet,
finally, he didn't
she
have
caught
to
the
worry
eye of
about
young
his
Duke
sexual
Qin and was
orientation
abducted
or whether
within
he
2
would have
days.
designs on him.
In the end, the
Li
matter
Xian
was
was the
left
crown
unresolved.
prince and was highly
Faced
valued
with
by
the other
the
party's
emperor,
background,
so his seat was
even the
naturally
Marquis
not
could
next
only
to Li
choose to
Yi's.
swallow his anger.
However, a
let
fifth-ranked
alone an
official
ordinary
next to Li
person.
Yi had been kicked
In this
off
matter,
somewhere by Li
there was not
Xian,
much
so
difference
he
between
naturally
ordinary
occupied the
people
other
and
seat.
county magistrates.
How much do you know about
He just didn't
Qin
know
Yu?
if Madman Qin would let Li Xianzi off for the
Li
sake of the
casually
king of
asked.
Shu. Li Xian furrowed his brows and said, "This person
Chapter
is a complete
383.
scoundrel, or
The
perhaps a
scholarly
madman.
man sitting at the
He
head
does
of the
things
table was
without
very
any
young.
rules like a mad dog.
He had just been driven
When he's
out by the
angry, he
steward of the
doesn't
king of
distinguish
Shu's
between
mansion
friend
and had
and
lost
foe.
a lot of face.
If it was just him,
However, at this
naturally
time,
no one
most
would be
people in the
afraid of
hall
him,
would not
but
mock
with
or
the addition
ridicule
of
him
Prime
because of
Minister
that,
Qin's
because
manner,
the person
there
sitting
aren't many
opposite him
people
and
in the
chatting
capital
happily
who are
with him
willing
was
to
the
offend him.
honorable king of Shu.
Li asked
The conversation
again,
between
in
Li
the entire
Yi and the
capital,
king of Shu
is there
was
really
actually
no
not
one who
as
can control
chatting
him?
happily,
Li
as
Xian
most
shook
people
his head
thought.
and said,
There was
"That's
really
not the
nothing to
case.
talk about with a
The
stranger.
problem is that although
Li
Qin
was
Yu
not
is
in a good
arrogant,
mood tonight.
it's only
The
because
king
he
of
doesn't
Shu
cultivate
obviously did not
morality.
have the charisma
He
of
doesn't
his
touch
father.
the interests of the
Of course,
nobles.
another
Out of
reason might
respect
be
for
that there were a
Prime
few
Minister
dishes
Qin,
in a bowl of
very
plain
few
porridge
people
on the
are
table.
willing to meddle in
The
his
location
affairs.
was not the
On
garden
the
of
other
Prince
hand,
Ning's
Prime
mansion,
Minister Qin
and
is
the
very
person
strict
opposite
with
him
him.
was not the
Every
middle-aged
time he causes
high-ranking
trouble,
official, he will be
whom Li
grounded
Yi
at
had a
home
good
for a
impression
period
of
of
at their
time.
first meeting.
However,
Your
after he
Highness,
is released,
flatter
he is
me.
still the same.
Li Yi had a
To
faint
tell the
smile
truth,
on
when
his
it comes
face,
to that
but
mad
he
dog,
kept a
even
distance
I don't
from
want
the
to have
king.
anything to do
The
with
king
him.
of Shu's intention
Li
to
Xian
rope him
looked
in
at him
could
and
not be
said,
more obvious.
"However, you don't have to worry.
Li Yi did
His
not
methods
expect
are
that the way
useless
to
on
rope
you."
him in was by
Furthermore,
praising
with
him,
his
saying
personality,
that
he was a
didn't
young
say or
hero,
do anything
a pillar
just
of the
now.
country,
It's
and that
clear
if he
that he
succeeded
doesn't
the
care
throne
about
in the
you.
future, he would
In
be
Li
heavily
Xian's view,
rewarded.
the person who
saying that
offended
he was the
Qin Yu the
blessing
most
of the
last
emperor,
night was
the blessing
himself.
of the Jing kingdom,
The person
and so
Qin Yu
on.
hated the most
There
was
were some words
presumably
that
him.
even Li Yi
This
himself
was also
felt a
the
little
reason why he
embarrassed
made
to
a
hear.
move.
Perhaps the
He
king
didn't
of
do
Shu was
anything.
tired of
Li
praising
Yi
and
smiled
thirsty.
and said,
Finally,
that I
he took a
slapped
sip
him
of
twice
tea,
just
looked
now
at Li
knocked
Yi
out a
and
few
asked
of his
with a
teeth
smile,
and knocked him
General Su
unconscious.
said in the letter
Li
that the
Xian looked at
soldiers
him.
of the Jing
The
kingdom
host of
are
tonight's
invincible
banquet
on the
was, of
battlefield
course, the
because
old
of
emperor.
Tianfa.
In
They can
reality,
kill
as
enemies
long as
and
it was in
destroy
the Jing
cities.
kingdom, no
I
matter
wonder
the
what this
occasion, he was
Tianfa
the only
is.
host.
How can it
However,
be so powerful?
tonight, in addition to
I
Emperor
heard
Jing,
that
who
this
was
Tianfa
shining, as always,
was created
there was
by
another
Li
person
Xianzi.
who was also
I
shining
wonder if Li
brightly.
Xianzi can answer
It was a
Ai's
middle-aged
doubts.
man with a
The
thin
king
face.
of Shu said with a
He was
smile,
not tall and
and
was
then his
sitting in
eyes
front of
fell
the
on Li
generals.
Yi. Even
Didn't
when
his
Emperor
Majesty
Jing
tell the
praised
king
him in
of
front
Shu
of all
about
the
it?
civil and
Li
military
asked
officials,
curiously.
he still had
The
a
king of
solemn
Shu shook
expression
his
on
head
his
and
face.
said, "My
It
father
seemed that
didn't
he was
mention
out of
it."
tune with the
Li Yi
atmosphere
thought
of
for a
tonight's
moment and
banquet.
quickly realized
However,
that although
no
the
one
name
thought that
Sky
he was
Law
abnormal
had been
because he was the
circulating
most
in the
serious
capital,
person in the
it was
Jing
not
kingdom.
very popular.
Because he was Su
The higher-ups
Dingyuan,
must
the
have
god of war of
deliberately
the Jing
controlled the
kingdom.
news in this
It was
area.
also the first time
However,
that Li Yi
even the
saw
king
this
of Shu,
legendary
the prince who
general.
was about to become
However,
the
because he
crown
was a
prince,
little far
did
away,
not
he
know
could
what
only see his
heaven's
silhouette
punishment
and could not
was.
see what he looked like.
It seemed that the old emperor
Fortunately,
had kept
he was
this
not
matter a
curious
secret
about
to
the
the
god of
extreme.
war's appearance.
This matter was too
Instead,
sensitive.
he was more
Li
interested in
didn't
the
want to
singing
test
and
the old
dancing in the
emperor's
middle of the
bottom
hall.
line.
The standard
He
of the
looked at
court
the king of
musicians
Shu
and
and said,
dancers was
"The
not just
matter
for
of heaven's
show.
punishment
As
is
the
not
king
a
of a
trivial
country,
matter.
he definitely
Since
wanted to
His
keep the
Majesty
best
didn't
things
tell
in the
your
palace.
highness,
It means that your highness can't know about
these
it.
entertainment
Moreover,
programs were
His
many
Majesty
times
has
more
issued an
professional than
extremely
what Li
strict
Yi had
gag
seen in
order,
the brothel.
so Li Xian
did not
clearly didn't
finish his
have the
words.
same level of appreciation.
He believed
At
that
this
the king
moment
of
he
Shu
was
would
still
definitely
muttering
understand
with
what he
that
meant.
madman's personality.
Sure enough,
You
the king
guys
of
won't
Shu was
rest until
startled
you're
for a
dead.
moment before he
Who knows what
immediately
that
smiled
madman
and
will
said,
do? Since
"Why don't
father
you
has
just
given
kill
the
him
order,
secretly?"
I have been rude. Li Xian
The
turned
king
to
of
look
Shu
at Li Yi
laughed
and
and
said,
drank the wine
"You
in
have a
his
lot
cup
of
in
evil
one gulp.
ideas." A trace
Think
of
about how to
displeasure
kill him
flashed
secretly.
across his face.
That guy,
which
once
was
he is
covered by
dead,
his
everything
sleeve.
will be over.
The son
of Chang'an County?
Who do you want to kill?
Not far away,
Do you need my help?
played with the empty
A
wine
rough
cup in
voice
his
came
hand.
from behind.
After glancing in a
was
certain
shocked and
direction,
quickly turned
he
his
seemed
head.
to unconsciously
When he saw the
murmur,
old man in luxurious
"Your Highness's
clothes
attitude
standing behind
towards
him
is really beyond my
awkwardly and said,
expectations." General
Chin
Shui
Li Jun's
Yun's
gaze
gaze
paused
paused there for a
I am
moment
the
before he
supervisor.
turned his
How
head
could I
and
do
said
that
while
kind of
shaking
thing?
his head.
Looks like
It was
this
just
old man is
accounting.
getting old.
Even if he
My
had some
ears aren't as
ability,
good.
there were many
The
capable
white-haired
people
old man
under the
with a
King of
ruddy
Shu's
complexion
command.
laughed and said,
Qin Yu's gaze
"This
did
is
not
General
move away
Shui."
from that direction.
To cover up his embarrassment,
He nodded and
Li
said,
Xian
"It's
hurriedly
really
introduced him
unexpected
to
to
meet
meet
such a woman
He
tonight.
only said this because
Chui
he
Qingyu
believed
and
that
Qin
Li
Li
Jun
must have
glanced
heard
at
of
him at
General
the same
Shui's
time.
name.
With
If
such a
General Su
grandson,
Dingyuan
Prime
was the
Minister
current god
Jin's
of war
clean
of the Jin
reputation
Kingdom,
should have been
then
almost
before him,
destroyed.
this title
He had a lot
always
of
belonged
wives
to
and
the old man in
concubines in
front
his
of him.
residence,
As long
but
as
he
it was a
liked married
citizen
women.
of the Jin
As
Kingdom,
long as he
who
liked
had
a
not
woman,
heard of
he
his
would
name.
use all means to
Even
get her.
General Su was a
At that
student
time,
taught by
Qin Yu
him.
did not care
General
about his
Shui?
relatives.
Li Yi was
Anyone
stunned
who
for a
tried to
moment.
stop him was his
When
enemy.
he regained his senses,
He even got his hands on an
stood up
uncle's
and said,
concubine.
"Greetings,
When
old
that
General
uncle went to
Shui.
complain to Prime
Ah,
Minister
old Shui,
Qin,
let's
he was
see what you
kicked
can
out of the
brag
room
about
by
in the
Qin Yu.
future."
From
What do
then
you
on,
mean by the
Madman
national general
name
that everyone knows in the Jin
Although he was
Kingdom?
grounded by
I have
Prime
never
Minister
heard of your
Qin
name
for 2 months,
Another
he still
burst
did
of
whatever
laughter
he wanted
came from
after he
behind.
was released. Soon,
Regarding
a few
this,
figures
the
walked
Qin
in front of
family
the
could
three
do
of them.
nothing about it.
General Shui,
Because he
who
was
had
the only
spoken
male
earlier,
descendant of
now
the
had
Qin
a face
family.
as black
In
as
order
the
to
bottom
not
of a
let this
pot.
family line
There was
end,
a hint of
as
shame
long as
and
he didn't
anger on
cause
his
any
face as he
scandals in the
stared at
family,
Li with his
even
bell-like
Prime
eyes
Minister
and said
Qin turned a
loudly,
blind eye to
"Boy,
his actions.
have you really not heard
It
of
was
my
unknown
name?"
how many memorials to impeach Qin Yu had been secretly suppressed. Chen Li Jun looked at him and asked, "Aren't you only interested in married women?" Although the old man was old, his body was still strong. Hearing this, Qin Yu waved his hand and said, "I've eaten too many salty things." Imposing. Occasionally, I have to change to something sweet. He was not born and raised in this world,
The two
so
shook
how
their
would he
heads
know
and
the
no
name
longer
of
cared
this old
about
general?
Qin Yu.
He was
They
not
came to the
Shui
prince's
Rengui or
mansion
Shui
tonight
Zhiqian.
to discuss
It was
important
not
matters,
strange that he did
which
not know his
represented
name
the
since
wishes
he
of
had
the
never heard
family.
of his stories or songs.
His Majesty's
Eye of
attitude
the
towards
moonlight
appointing
tonight
a
is
crown
not
prince
bad.
was not clear,
Old General
and the
Shui,
joint
please have a
memorials
seat.
submitted by
I'll
several
go out and
ministers
look at the
had been
moon for a
suppressed.
while.
A few
Excuse
days
me.
ago, the plan to
Li
unite with the
cleverly
Wang
changed the
family
topic.
by marriage had
He
also
did not want to
failed.
embarrass the
They
old
did not
general
win
or
the
himself.
support of the Wang family of Jiangyi,
The people
which was
behind
not
General
good
Shui
news for
laughed
the king
even
of
louder.
Shu.
They
In
also
order to
deal
deal
with
with
this
this
young man
unexpected
was too ignorant
situation in
for
the
not
future,
knowing Shui
they had to make
name.
sufficient
After all,
preparations.
for a young
The
man
two
of his
talked in
age,
secret
he should
for
have
a
heard of
while
this
and
name
saw the
since he
king
was
of
a
Shu
child.
stand up and walk
However,
over.
being able to personally witness
When the king
the
of
most
Shu
arrogant
sat down,
fellow among
Cui
them
Qin
being
looked at him and
humiliated
asked,
made them feel
"Is
rather
that person
delighted.
really that important?"
This is General Shui.
It's always
Wancheng.
good if we can win
Li
over the
Xian
person
reminded
that my
him in a
father
low
values.
voice.
The
There was
king of
only
Shu's
one
face
General
did not
Shui
look
in
very
the Jin
good.
Kingdom.
Just
If
now,
Li
his
did not
intention
know
to
him,
win
he
over
could
Li
not do
Xianzi was
anything
very
about it.
obvious, but Li
Li
Xianzi
Xianzi
kept changing the topic.
Li Yi revealed
No
an
matter what
expression of sudden
promises he
realization
made,
and
he did not
hurriedly
show
said,
any willingness
"Old
to be
General
loyal.
Shui, please don't
He did
blame
not
me.
know how to
This
appreciate
is the
favors.
first time I've attended a
Seeing the
banquet
king
of
of
this
Shu's
level,
face,
so I was a
Cui
little
Qin
nervous
and the
and
other
didn't
two were
remember.
slightly surprised.
Old General Shui's name is
Obviously,
really
the king
well
of
known.
Shu did not get
I've
the
heard of
result
your
he
deeds
wanted.
since I was young.
He was actually
To be able
rejected
to
by
meet
the
you
other
today
party.
is really the
How
honor
could this
of
be
3
possible?
lifetimes. He was the king
Who
of
didn't know
Shu,
how to
not
say
the king
polite
of Wei,
words?
Qi, or Jing.
From the looks of it,
He was
this
the
old
king of
general
Shu
was
who was
really a
most likely
celebrity.
to ascend to
In
the
order
throne.
to express the
Compared
joy
to
and
Qin Yu,
excitement
he
of a
was the
fan
real
meeting
lunatic.
his idol,
You
Li
don't
Yi
like
felt
the
the
king
king
of
of
used
Shu.
all the acting
Lu
skills he
Rui
had
sat
learned in 2
opposite Li Yi
lifetimes.
and looked up at him.
If it was not for
Li
the
Yi
fact that
glanced at her and
autographs
said,
were not
"Of
popular
course
in
I
this
don't
era,
like the king of
he
Shu.
could have acted
I
more
like your
realistically.
sister and I also like
Oh,
silver.
then why don't you
Gold
tell
is
me
fine
what I've
too."
done?
The
Lu
old
Rui
man
did not
stroked
look
his
at him
beard
again,
and seemed to have
nor did she
accepted
speak
Li Yi's
again.
explanation.
We're going to be
After
bandits
all,
in the future,
there were
so
not
it's
many
better not
people
to
in
get
this
involved in
generation
this
who had
kind of
not
thing.
heard of his name.
Li Yi added.
He casually
He did
asked
not
another
really like
question.
or dislike the
A
king
black
of Shu,
line appeared
but
on
he
Li
did
Yi's
not want to
face
get
once
involved
again.
in his affairs.
Was this old man
Since
looking for
ancient
an awkward
times,
situation?
those who got involved
He
in such
suddenly
things
laughed
did not
again
end up
and looked
well.
out of the hall.
Although the king of
He
Shu was
praised,
the favorite
"The
to
moon
win the
tonight is
championship.
really nice.
If he were to bet
Old
on him,
General
he would
Shui
probably
exerted
get a
some
lifetime
force
of
and pulled
wealth.
a few strands
The
of beard from
opportunity
his
that he
chin.
had just turned down
Li
was
Yi
something
and
that
Li
countless
Xian were
people
surrounded
dreamed
by
of.
a group of
However,
generals.
deep down,
I say,
Li
was
was
Tian
not
optimistic
optimistic
about
about
the
the
king
king
of
of
Shu?
Shu.
The
Although
famous
the current
General
emperor
Shui
was
sat in
unwell,
front of Li Yi
after
and
several
said as he tore
interactions with
apart a
him,
juicy
Shawnee
chicken
had
leg.
inadvertently
Li Yi
revealed
didn't dare to say
and
that the
Li Yi
reason the
had sensed from this
drumstick was
country
still there was
the
because he had
seemingly
accidentally
kind-looking
dropped it
middle-aged
on the
man was
ground.
wise and farsighted.
Hearing his words,
He was a
Li Yi
very
glanced
qualified
at the old
emperor.
emperor's seat
How
and
could a
didn't say a
qualified
word.
emperor leave the position of the Eastern Palace empty
Even
when
if
his
Li
own
Xian
life
asked
was
him
about
about
to
this,
end? He would not
everyone
be able
in
to
the
get
world
any
thought
useful
that this
information
position
should belong to
Hearing
the king
the
of
two
Shu,
words,
and so
divine
did the king
punishment,
of Shu and
Li
countless
Xian's spirit
courtiers.
was clearly
However,
aroused.
this position
He
did not
hurriedly
belong
pricked
to
up
him
his
yet,
ears
so
to
it would
listen.
never belong to
Not
him.
bad, kid.
It was not
Remember,
the king of
you
Shu's
can't
turn
tell
to be
anyone
the
except
emperor,
His
and
Majesty.
of course, it was not
General
his turn
Shui
to sit on
nodded
the
and
throne.
said with satisfaction,
Since it had nothing to
"But
do with him,
after he said
let
that,
go.
he
Of course,
suddenly
apart
changed
from
the
this,
topic
there were
and
many
said,
other reasons.
"That thing belongs
For
to the
example,
military."
the king of Shu was
Although
not
we don't know
handsome
the
enough,
formula,
and he
the
did
old
not
guys
like the
here know
clothes he
better than anyone else how many things it can contain and how many people it can kill. You don't have to hide calling him Prince Jin. Only then did Li realize that the people present were the most senior group of people in the Jin Kingdom's military. It was not an exaggeration at all. The formula that the emperor would not tell reasons like there was no way he could hide anything else from them. Since that was the case, there was nothing to worry about. 384. Li said straightforwardly, "What does your highness see in Li? That thing was created by me." Li Jun's eyes paused in a certain direction. Another old general patted his knee. Then he turned his head and looked at the admiration on his face. His Majesty is becoming more and more stingy. He also had doubts about this viscount title. If Qin Haodong another old general ridiculed him and asked and write a few articles, I heard that horseshoes were also created by you. Pay much attention. I think so. Just because His Majesty valued him was not also created by divine punishment. Maybe the King of Shu said in a low voice. The general was indeed a general. Even his words were so direct. Pupils shrank slightly. The words created and they couldn't help but stand up straight. Think about it. For some reason, trained in the military for a few years, divine punishment, General Shui stared at him with shining eyes and was limited to some high-level officials. It would be a pity not to put you in the military. How could they not have heard of it? With you, there will be fewer soldiers sacrificed. It was just that they didn't know the specific details of this matter. Teach you personally. Even the elders and their families maybe in a few years there was a heavily guarded place outside the city. which seemed to be related to divine punishment. It was already scary
His
enough
Majesty
to be
had
firmly
firmly
controlled
controlled
this
this
matter. So
what would
others
happen
knew
if he
very
were to
little
enter
about
the
it.
military?
So what? How long would
What
it
kind
take
of
to
person
see
is your
Louis if he had
highness?
to face a bunch
You
of
will know
rough
about
men
this
every
sooner
day?
or later.
Moreover,
Qin
would be
Yu
willing
withdrew
to
his
be
gaze
taught by
and
that
said,
stern face.
"In fact,
Your
he
Highness was a
rejected
little
old
reckless
General
just now.
Shue's suggestion
Your
without
Highness
even
still
thinking
doesn't know
about it.
about this matter.
When he
which
habitually
means
looked
it's not
at the
time
moon
for your
outside the
Highness
hall,
to know about
General
it.
Shui
If you
impatiently
act too
waved his hand
impatient,
and said,
you may arouse
"Stop
His
looking.
Majesty's
There is no
dissatisfaction.
moon tonight."
Even if you
Li
really
retracted
retracted
his
his
gaze
gaze
and
and
picked
picked
up
up
the
the
teacup
teacup
on
you
the
will
table.
lose more than you gain.
He carefully
Qin Li
examined it
Jun
and
could
could
not
not
help
help
but
but
exclaim,
exclaim,
although
"The
Qin Yu
workmanship
didn't
of
do
this
cup
cup
is
is
really
really
exquisite.
It didn't mean that he was a
I wonder
complete
where it was
playboy.
made.
On
General
the contrary,
Shui's face
his
darkened and
insight
said,
into things
just
was
like what
often
His
the
Majesty
sharpest
said,
among them.
you are a little
The
kid.
Qin family was
You are
not
so
only
young,
noble,
but you are so ambitious.
Marquis Qin was
How many
also the
people
right
have
chief
begged for it,
minister
but you
and
do
a
not
veteran
care?
of 3 dynasties.
Are you planning to be
The
a
king of
lousy
Shu
county
couldn't get to where
magistrate
he
for the
was
rest of
today
your
without
life?
the advice of the Qin family.
What material are these
That makes
chopsticks
sense.
made of?
The king
Don't
of Shu
tell me they
nodded.
are made of jade?
Qin Yu's words
This is
were
the
almost
palace after
exactly
all.
the same as Li Xianzi's. The most
Even
important reason
chopsticks
he
are
wanted
so
to win over Li
luxurious.
Xianzi was
The
to
few
get
old generals
divine
looked at each other
punishment.
speechlessly.
Now, after
They knew
Qin
that
Yu's
their plan
reminder,
to
he
recruit
knew
him
that
into
he
the
couldn't
military
touch
was
it
going
now.
to fail.
When he could really touch it,
heavenly
Li Xianzi
punishment,
wouldn't be
and
of
even
much
the
use
method
to
to
him.
save the
You
injured
guys
soldiers.
talk first. Every
I'll
one
go
of
over
these
for a
matters
while.
was extremely
A
important
mysterious
to them.
smile appeared
If
on
such a
Qin
person
Yu's
could not
face.
be used by the
After saying
military,
a few words
even
to
the
the
heavens
three
would
of them,
not allow it.
he got up and
When they
walked off
first
in a
made this
certain
request to
direction.
His Majesty,
After the King
His
of Shu
Majesty
and
had
the other
said that
two
as long
turned
as they
around
could
to
get
take a
his
look,
consent,
a strange
he could be
expression
trained and appeared
appeared
on
on
their
their
faces. They thought that it would be a
Mississippi
simple
Lu did
matter
not
if they
speak.
worked together.
She felt a little
Who would
bored
have thought
sitting
that
there.
when faced with
Her
old Shui's
conversation with the
straightforward
King of Shu
recruitment,
had
he
ended
would
on a
actually
sour
study
note.
the teacup and chopsticks. Although she
No
did
matter
not
how
know
much
if
the
the
King
King
of
of
Shu
Shu was a petty
was
person
useless
who
in
bore
this
grudges,
situation.
it was
If it was
fortunate
someone
that she
else,
would
they
not
would
have
not
to
care
attend
so
those
much.
messy banquets
They
in
would
the King
first
of Shu's
kidnap him
mansion
into
in
the
the
military.
future. Her time
Once
was
there,
precious
His
and could not
Majesty's
be
words
wasted
would
on
not
these
be of
things.
any use.
Just as she
However,
was thinking of an
His
excuse
Majesty
to
had
leave
clearly
again,
said that
a
they were
figure
not to
suddenly
force
appeared
this young
beside
man
her.
in front of them.
It was young Duke
If they did
Qin.
not force him, they would
He
not
looked
know
at
where to
Mississippi
start.
Lu with a smile
Even when
and
they were
asked,
surrounded
"May
by
I
the
know your
enemy,
surname,
the
miss?"
few old generals
Li
had not
didn't
had
know
such
whether
a
he
headache.
should admire his foresight or his courage. When it came to this kind of thing, Mississippi Lu never
Chapter
cared about the
395.
little duke or the prince.
Forget
the
it.
expression on her
If you
face
don't want
did
to
not
go to the
change
army,
at all
I
because
won't
of these
force you.
words. But
She did
remember,
not
if
even
you
lift her
encounter any
eyelids.
problems in the
Seeing
future,
this, the
you can
smile
come to
on
us
Qin
old
Yu's
fellows.
face became even
Let's
brighter.
not talk about other
He
things,
continued,
but we can
"Let
protect
me
you in the
introduce
capital.
myself.
My
Just
name
as
is
Li
Qin
Yi
Yu.
was about to
The
go
current
against his
chief minister
conscience
is
and
my
praise the
grandtable
father.
in front of him for
I wonder
being
if I
rare.
have the honor to
Old
buy you
General
a
Shui
drink."
seemed to have given up and
As
finally
expected,
waved his
young
hand.
Duke Qin likes that
There's
girl.
still one thing that
What
I
a
don't
pity,
understand.
what a pity.
Li Yi
Such a
finally
stunning beauty
regained his
can't escape
composure
such
as he
a
looked
fate.
at old General Shui.
That county
You want to
magistrate
ask us
we
why
really
we old
shouldn't have
fellows
brought
are
the
so
girl
nice
here
today?
today.
Doesn't he
General
know
Shui
that young
asked
Duke
without
Qin
even
will
lifting his
definitely
head.
be at the banquet of
Li
the
Yi
King
thought
of
to
Shu?
himself that these old
Because of
generals
young
weren't
Duke
as
Qin's
rash and
reputation,
boorish as they
no
appeared
one
to
dared
be.
to say anything.
Their words and actions
Only in
were
a
clear
remote
and
corner
logical,
far away,
and
there
they
were
could
people
even think of
whispering.
things that he couldn't
Other
think
than
of.
their small area,
After all,
no one
they
would
were
be able
old
to
men
hear
who
them.
had lived for decades
However,
and were
Li
older
Yi
than
knew
both
that
of
Mississippi
Li's
Lu
lifetimes
must be able to
combined.
hear it because
They
he could
could see
vaguely
through
hear
Li
it
Yi's
himself.
thoughts with a single
Then
glance.
he began to feel a
The
little
old fox had
uncomfortable.
grown into an
This
old
young
fox.
Duke Qin in front
When
of
he
him
met
looked
these old
well-dressed,
generals or old
but he
men
was
in the
actually
future,
a beast
he
inside.
must not underestimate
No, some
them.
of the things he did
You'll
were even
understand
worse
when
than
you
a beast.
actually arrive on the
Who knew
battlefield.
what this beast was
Old
thinking
General
in his
Shui
heart
said
when he was
faintly as a
facing
look
this
of
look?
reminiscence
Not
appeared
to
on his
mention
face.
talking,
No
no
one
one
knew
felt
better
that he
than
was at
these
a
old generals
disadvantage
how
even if he
powerful
just
the thing he
glanced
had
at
invented
Mississippi
was on the
Lu.
battlefield.
Chui Yinxin,
Which of the
who was
old
standing in
generals
the corner,
present hadn't killed
still
their
had a
way out of
stunned
a mountain
expression
of
on his
corpses
face.
and a sea of
He
blood.
did not expect
They
that
had
things would turn
experienced
around
countless
so
battles
quickly.
in their lives. Young Duke Qin without that them, girl, the Jing kingdom wouldn't have existed. Quickly showed in every battle of extreme was their brothers and comrades who sacrificed everyone in the capital city knew about the relationship between young Duke Qin and the king of Shu. No one knew when or where definitely not help the guy of generals would die on the battlefield. Then things would become much more interesting. Had given them a huge gift. If it were not for the fact that they were still at the banquet, compared to this huge gift, really want to look up to the sky and was not worth mentioning at all. You deserve it was just that Li Yi hadn't realized this yet. Please inform His Royal Highness the General Shu that we still have some matters to attend to at home. Gaze over. We will take our leave for old General Shui to say such words. Up and said to the steward that he really values you. Steward so many old generals standing behind you. He looked at the young man who he had just personally invited in and thought to himself, Li Xian was really envious. The king of Shu is right there. These old generals had fought for the country all their lives. Go and say it yourself. Their fathers, just as he was thinking about this, had all done their best for the country. Invited back what they did was the most dangerous and walked out of the door. Because of this, Shu's expression did not attach great importance to the watchful eyes of the crowd. Could even be said that he favored without saying a word. In the capital, these old generals were unreasonable existences. What would the crowd think of him? Even if Li Xian met them, he would have to be respectful. However, if he stood out now, it would be making inexplicably received the old general's promise. He snorted coldly and did not say anything. He was also happy. This lady, you won't even give me this face, will you? Just as Li Yi was about to walk out of the door, A voice suddenly came from behind him.
Does that mean that the next time I meet the king behind him and reached out to grab Mississippi Lu's shoulder?
Li Xian was stunned for a
Qin
moment.
Yu had a faint smile.
It took him
on
a
his
while
face
to react.
Those who were familiar with him would feel a chill run down their spines when they saw this expression.
His face is the face
However,
of the royal
the
family.
smile on his face
If you
quickly
slap him,
disappeared.
you will be slapping
This
the royal
was because
family.
before his hand
The
could
king of
touch
Shu
the
will
woman's
not
shoulder,
forgive you,
a
and neither
hand
will
reached
Uncle
out from the
Huang.
side and grabbed his wrist.
Is that so?
That person
Li
was
couldn't
so
help
fast
but
that
feel a
Qin Yu
little
did not even
disappointed.
see it clearly.
Other than
The
slapping
skinny
the
man
king
behind
Shu,
Qin Yu saw
he
it
didn't
clearly.
seem to have anything
A
else
trace
that
of
he wanted to
surprise
do
appeared
but
on
couldn't.
his face. Then he thought
He
of
moved
something
slightly
and asked,
and stood
"What
behind
about
Qin Yu?"
killing Qin Yu?"
Qin Yu's smile
When Li Xian
disappeared.
heard this, he immediately
narrowed his
became
eyes
interested.
and looked at Li Xian.
He whispered,
He was no
"That's
longer as
possible, but you have to
enthusiastic
do
as
it
when they first
secretly.
met.
Don't get caught."
He said indifferently,
Prime Minister
"If you
Qin
don't let
isn't
go of
someone
him
to be
after
trifle
3
breaths.
breaths,
If
I will
something
chop
really
off his
happens,
hand."
even Uncle
The skinny
Huang
man
won't be
behind
able to
Qin Yu
protect us.
nodded expressionlessly.
In short, this matter
One of
can't
his
be done
hands was
hastily.
already on the hilt
We
of
have
the
to plan
saber
it
at his
carefully.
waist.
Just
The
as
king of
Li
Shu
Yi and
faintly
Li
heard
Xian
his
were
voice.
discussing how to
He
kill
frowned
Madman
slightly,
Qin without
stood up
being
from his
discovered,
seat,
and
on
walked
the
out.
other side of the hall.
This was the
Prime
king of
Minister
Shu's
Qin
mansion.
was chatting with a
Qin
few
Yu
other
could make a
officials.
scene, but he could
Then
not
he
go too
walked
far.
back to his seat,
If
looked
Li
around the
Xian's
hall,
hand
and
was really
furrowed his
chopped off
brows.
here, it would
At
be a
this moment,
troublesome matter
a young
for him.
man hurriedly came
One
from
reason was
behind
that
and
it
said,
would be difficult to
"Grandfather
explain it to
Qin,
the
it's
emperor."
bad."
Another
Young Duke
reason was
Qin,
that he could not
what did this
explain it to
bastard
Mingzu
do this time?
Even if he
After
became
a
the crown
moment,
prince, he
Prime
would not
Minister
be able to
Qin
get away
frowned
with
and
it.
looked in a certain
When
direction
everyone
at the
heard
entrance
Qin
of
Yu's
the hall.
words, they could not
I
help
think
but
it's a
shiver.
good idea to hire
Crazy
someone to
Qin
kill
was
Qin
indeed
Yu.
Crazy Qin.
Qin Yu doesn't
This
have
was
many
the king of
guards.
Shu's mansion.
If we hire a
Under the
powerful
watchful
assassin
eyes
with a
of
lot
the
of
public,
money,
we
can
chopped
make
off
him
someone's
disappear
hand and
forever.
foot without saying
Even
a
if
word.
we are caught,
In the
won't be
entire
able to
capital
find
city,
out our
he was
identities.
probably the only one
Qin
who
Yu
dared
has
to
too
do
many
this.
enemies, and there
After
are too
saying
many
that,
people
Qin
who want
Yu
him dead.
automatically ignored
Li
Li
Xian felt that he
His
had come
face
up with a
regained a
brilliant
kind
idea.
smile. In his
He
complacency,
looked at the
he raised
beautiful
his
woman in
voice.
front of him and said,
However, he
"Gu."
didn't notice that an
He
official
only said
dressed
one
in a
word before
scarlet
he stopped
official's robe
abruptly.
was already
The expression
dumbfounded.
on his face
Through
was
his
very
idea,
stiff, and a
Li
trace
summed
of
up 18
disbelief
ways for
appeared in
young
his
Duke
eyes.
Qin to die. This was because
He
he inadvertently
inadvertently
raised his
sword was
head and
placed on
seemed to
his
see
neck.
someone looking in
This
his
sword was
direction.
very sharp.
When he looked
Qin Yu
carefully,
could
he
even
only
feel
saw
a
the
line of
figures
blood
of a
being
few
drawn on his
unfamiliar
neck.
officials. At this
The
moment,
feeling
he
just
really
now
felt
seemed
that
to
his
have
life
never
and
appeared.
death were only a matter
He
of
shook his head
seconds.
and began to think about other
The
things.
woman looked at him with
He
an
had Li Xian
emotionless
to
gaze.
accompany him here, so
She
he
only
had
said
someone to
one
talk
word.
to.
Her
He didn't know
voice
how
seemed
Rui
to come
was
from the
doing.
depths of
The
hell.
young princess
Turning
was
to
born
ice
in a
when it
rich
touched the
family and
ground.
should not have much in
Get
common
lost.
with her.
That was
He didn't
what the
know if
woman
she
said.
would be bored.
Qin
The
Yu's
hall
face
was
was
full of
completely
singing and
pale.
dancing.
He
and
felt
it
that
seemed
his
that
neck
no
was
one
a
was
little
paying
wet and
attention
hot,
to this side,
probably because
Li
of blood
sneaked
flowing
out.
out. He had
The
just
pupils
stepped
of
out
the
of the
thin
hall
man
and
behind
walked a
him
few
suddenly
steps when he
shrank.
heard a faint voice
He
behind
held
him.
the hilt of his sword
Even if
with one
Qin Yu
hand,
has offended
but he
you
did
in
not
some
have
way,
the strength to
isn't
pull
it
it
too
out.
heavy for the
Fast,
county
too
magistrate
fast.
of Chang'an?
It
It was a speed that exceeded his imagination. Li looked
two of
back
them
and
had
saw
not
an old man
exchanged
in
blows,
plain clothes
but he
standing
already
behind
knew
him.
very well that
The old
this
man
young
said
woman's
calmly.
strength was much,
The old
much
man's
higher
clothes
than
were
his.
very ordinary.
This was also
and
one
his
of the
appearance
reasons
was
why he
even
did
more
not have the
ordinary.
courage to pull out
Only
his
his
sword.
eyes were
His
particularly
heart was
sharp,
instantly
as if
filled
they
with
could see
endless
through
fear.
people's hearts at
With
a
the power
glance.
that she had displayed
Prime
with her
Minister
sword
Qin,
just now,
Li
it would
stopped
only
and
take
looked
a
at the
thought
old
for her
man.
to kill the
The
heir
old
to the
man
High
didn't
Duke.
admit or deny
Even
it.
His Highness the
After
King
a
of Shu
moment,
would be in
Li
danger.
smiled and said,
If she was
Prime
willing,
Minister Qin,
the
you
thin
know what
man
kind
could
of
not
person
help
Qin
but
Yu
curse
is.
in his heart.
I think you have
What
a
were the
conclusion
people
in your
of the King
mind
of
whether
Shu
I was
doing?
heavy or not.
How could they allow
Why do you
such
say
an
this?
expert to bring a weapon
The old
in?
man frowned
Quickly
slightly.
let go of the
He was a
little
righteous
Duke.
man.
Otherwise,
If
no
others
matter
had done
who you
those
are,
things, he
you
would have
will
not
already
be able to
stopped
bear
them.
the consequences.
However, when it involved
the
the
thin
only
man said in a
legitimate
low
son of the
voice,
Qin family,
if anything
he
happened to
naturally
the
couldn't
little
treat
Duke
him as an
Qin,
ordinary
not only
person.
would the other party
When he
not
made
be
a
able to bear
mistake,
the
he could punish him
consequences,
however he
even
wanted.
he himself would
In
not
fact,
be able
he
to
had
bear
always
it.
been strict with
He and his
Qin Yu at
family
home.
would all be responsible
However, he
for
didn't
this.
want to let
Of
outsiders
course,
do
if
these
anything
things for happened to His Highness the King of Shu himself, even more people would be implicated. He directly tore apart all the concealment and went straight to his heart. Lu Rui, as the Prime Minister, he must know about whether anyone else what was right or wrong, or to kill him and then kill his way out with bastard. Not long after, Prime Minister Qin cursed in his heart. Saw a flash of naturally, white light he thought of some dirty things and thought that maybe he should discipline him well again. Otherwise, the reputation that the Qin family had accumulated for decades would be ruined in his hands on his face. However, being questioned by a young man in his face, licking the blood off his fingers with his tongue, still felt a little embarrassed. A bloodthirsty light seemed to flash in his eyes. Turned around and walked back in. From the moment Mississippi Lu drew her sword to the moment she cared about his face, only a very short time had passed. Heart slightly when the King of Shu walked out, he only saw the tense atmosphere outside. He didn't know if the Empress's birthday banquet of the King's mansion surrounded the two people. He walked out of the hall and took a look. The thin man behind Qin looked as if he was facing a formidable enemy. When he was about to sneak back, he suddenly stopped and saw from his expression that he was about to go crazy. Yonghe Palace in the night. Your Highness, this woman wanted to assassinate the little Duke Qin just now. A guard of the king's mansion immediately came forward and reported. This woman is extremely dangerous. The palace maids and eunuchs guarding Princess Yong looked up and bowed slightly to him. For them, the safety of the king of Shu was the most important. In this world, Among all the people the little princess had met, several people immediately stood in front of the king of Shu and looked warily at the woman holding the sword. Li sat down next to her. The king of Shu was shocked when he saw the bloodline and then turned back to look at the sword in the woman's hand. There was no expression on her little face. Someone actually dared to kill the eldest grandson of the Qin's mansion with a sword in the king of Shu's mansion. There was light in them, but there was no life beside Li Xianzi. He had seen the people in the hall could no longer sit still and rushed to the door. They seemed to be different from the eyes in front of him. After realizing what had just happened, this made Li Yi feel that the situation wasn't that bad. Although countless people in the capital wanted to kill Qin Yu with a sword, of course this was something to be happy about. Someone dared to do so. Li sat for a while, they wanted to curry favor with the king of Shu because of his current status and future potential, but it didn't mean that they had to kneel down and lick Qin Yu's eyes dimmed slightly. As for Li Xianzi, she grabbed the hem of her robe a little harder, heroine for the time being, loosened they still had some respect in their hearts. She stood up and prepared to walk to the palace in the distance, and what they did was another. It was dark and quiet there. They admired Li Xianzi for having the courage to put a sword against Qin Yu's neck. A familiar voice suddenly came from behind. Pity. She stopped in her tracks and slowly turned around. They committed murder, a chicken leg in his mouth and attempted to assassinate little Duke Qin. He put them on the well-lit steps. Under the eyes of the king of Shu, hurry up. If this crime was confirmed, what awaited them would be terrible in his hands. Just as they were thinking about this, were puzzled, they heard a faint voice on the hint of inquiry in it. Okay, put the things down and you can go back. To look at the king of Shu and asked, see if there's any grape wine on the table. Can we go now? Forget it, wine is still everyone couldn't come back to their senses. Li waved his hand and said the situation in front of him clearly. Didn't care about Li's behavior. The woman put a long sword. Instead, he was surprised by the way Li acted. It would be more difficult for them to leave here tonight than to ascend to leave. The king of Shu was a little stunned at first, and then he was a little puzzled. The little girl. He wondered why he was sitting inside. He actually didn't have much appetite. Do you think it's appropriate to let you leave like this? He wasn't interested in even the most exquisite dishes. Because of the injury on his neck, he felt that eating on the steps outside was more atmosphere. Although he was smiling, he looked mainly because it was quiet. I think it's quite appropriate. There wouldn't be Li Xian nagging by his ear, and there wouldn't be those old generals bothering him. Asked, Princess Yongning didn't speak. Until now, Li Yi hadn't heard her say even a word. Disappeared. I have to leave for a while. He suddenly realized that Li Xianzi seemed to be a little different from before. We might not see each other for a long time. The king of Shu looked at him and said indifferently, when I come back, I'll treat you to someone in the prince's mansion with a sword. Yongning only lowered her head to eat and did not respond to Li's words. If Li Xianzi had given him a satisfactory answer, seeing that Shu wouldn't have minded intervening, he switched the dish next to her. Qin Yu was a lunatic. Then he put down his chopsticks and really crazy, looked at the palace wall in the distance. Ignore the king of Shu's opinion. From time to time, there would be some noise coming from inside the palace. Didn't intend to do this for an unrelated person. In the distance, he pointed to the palace wall that stretched as far as the eye could see. Men, arrest them and hand them over to the authorities, causing people to involuntarily have a suffocating feeling. Even though he was a king, he didn't have the authority to arrest people. For a long time. It was fine if they did. He had been here for half a year. However, under the watchful eyes of so many people, forgetting was human nature. Was involved. Except for a few people, everything had to be done according to the law. When he first came to this world, he would think about how to go back almost every day. About to step forward. It had been a long time since he had thought about a sword. At this moment, saw the woman draw her sword again, in such emotions they immediately became vigilant. Because people started coming out of the palace narrowed his eyes and said coldly, the banquet was over. Do you still want to assassinate? Stood up and waved to the little girl. See you next time. When he walked outside, a middle-aged palace maid came over and begged, even a prince has to be reasonable. Come to the palace often to see the little turned around, took the sword from Mississippi. It's not easy for the little princess. Put it back into the scabbard her and said while shaking his head. He looked back at the little girl sitting on the steps and walked to Li Xianzi waving at him. They were now in the king of Shu's behind the wall. Princess Yongning was too naive to reason with the king of Shu and palace maids hurried over and led her to the depths of the palace. In the depths of second young Miss Lu's eyes, the banquet of the old emperor it was fortunate that he ended at the same time. Otherwise, when Li Xian walked to the front of the Phoenix Cry Palace, if it weren't for him today, they saw the women coming out of the palace. The king of Shu, there were quite a few people waiting outside the hall like them. Just the guards that the king of Shu's household had displayed on the surface tonight were husband to carry the shoes of Li Xian's heirs household. Li Xian waited until almost everyone had left before the furies of the crown princess and Rui appeared in their line of sight. Of course, he couldn't let Rui do that. To be more accurate, killing two big pigs at once, it would be inconvenient for him to run away walking side by side. Moreover, the king of Shu could be unreasonable to others, but he couldn't be unreasonable to him. At least his expression became extremely complicated. Now he was no longer the man who was kidnapped. Although she was about the same age as his aunt, the last time he saw her, she had only been in her early 20s. Was neither short nor long. She was so haggard, enough to change particularly from the white hair occasionally peeking out from her temples. When he looked back, he realized what she had experienced during this period of time. At least he wouldn't be bullied at will anymore. If there were people in Jingdo that Li Yi did not want to face, Qin would not be in the top 10, and the old emperor back in Miss Lu's hand, turned around, young lady of the Qin family was the one he did not want to see the most. Just now, since he had accepted the one who wanted to commit murder when he met this young lady of the Chen family, just defending ourselves. He could not help but feel guilty. I'm afraid this is not enough to assassinate him. Normal people would not be able to understand this kind of feeling. Everyone could only sigh at the naive Li Xianzi. Even if the original owner of this body was still alive, what young Duke Qin wanted to do was one thing, and what Li Shenzi wanted to do was another in his heart. How could they be the same? It was nothing, don't worry about it. Young Duke Qin had the support of the king of Shu and a grandfather who was talking to the woman. What about Li Shenzi? Smiled. The king of Shu said lightly. Qin Yu was just
when
saying,
she saw a certain
he didn't
figure
really
standing
chop
not
off
too
your
far
hand.
away,
However,
her
body
body
trembled slightly,
even if it's
and
not
a hint
an
of assassination
flashed in her
still a
eyes.
crime. Soon after,
Li looked
she
at
seemed
him
to
and
have
asked,
thought of something,
Your Highness
and that
means
hint
that
of
if someone
excitement
wants to
quickly
assassinate
disappear,
your Highness,
replaced
they
by a
must
hint
first
of
chop
pain.
off one of your
My
Highness's
husband and
hands
Li
before it
Shenzi
can
are
be
already
considered
waiting
an
for us there.
assassination.
The
Crown
king of Shu
Princess
opened
smiled
his
and
mouth
looked at the woman,
but he couldn't find
I don't
any
know if your
words to
family has
refute.
come.
Then
We will be leaving
Then he
first.
flew into a rage out
The
of
woman
humiliation.
nodded and then raised her
How
head to
dare
look
you,
at Li.
he said coldly.
She said,
Are you
Your wife
threatening
is
I?
very good.
Li was a little
my
speechless.
husband?
Didn't
Rui
they
looked
agree
at her
to be
with some
reasonable?
surprise and asked,
Who was threatening
This
who now?
time the woman did not
Yu's neck
reply.
was only scratched
She
a
walked
little
forward
and was
on
no
her
longer
own
bleeding.
and quickly disappeared
He
from
sneered
everyone's
and said,
sight.
Oh, you said
Husband
that I
this.
wanted to commit murder
Rui
first.
looked at the woman's
Who saw
departing
it?
figure and then looked at Li.
He turned
heart
around
was
and
filled
pulled a
with
random
confusion.
youth over, asking,
It's a long story.
Did you see it?
We will talk about
No.
it when we get back.
The young man kept shaking
Li
his
sighed
head
and felt
not
inexplicably suffocated in his heart.
Did you see
Seeing
that?
such a story
Qin
in an
Yu
opera
loosened
would
his
not
grip
be able
and
to
pulled
move
another
people
one
much.
over.
However, when it
What
really
about
happened
you?
in front of his eyes
No,
and
no,
he saw the
I
change
didn't
of the
see
woman
it
in
either.
just a few days,
Qin
from
Yu
her
pulled a
beautiful
few
face to
people in
her
a
old
row,
face,
and everyone
from
kept
her
shaking
fine
their
black hair
heads.
to her white hair.
How could they dare
Li
to
could
go
only
against
sigh in
young
his
Duke
heart
Qin and the
curse
king
his
of
sins.
Shu?
A
Li
bright
Minghan,
smile
you are
appeared on
mother
his face and he said,
bastard.
Look, they all said
In
they
the
didn't
end,
see
he
it,
could not
but
help
you
but
actually
curse
framed
in a
me.
low voice.
It seems that I have
Who is a
offended them
bastard?
even more. Li Xian turned
The
his
few
head to
people
look
who
at
were dragged
Li in
over by him
confusion.
just now couldn't
He thought
help
that
but
even
step
Qin Yu
back,
had not been
causing
scolded
the people
like this.
behind them to move
It
back as
seemed
well.
that the person he
Seeing
cursed
is
just now
believing.
must have offended
Crazy
him greatly.
Qin
Was indeed worthy of his reputation. In front of so many people he inverted black and
Chapter
white, but
397.
no one dared to speak the
Just
truth.
now, a palace
Naturally,
maid dropped
they
a
had to
tray
stay
and
almost
almost
far
hit
away
that
from him
lady.
as possible.
I happened to be
Li
next to her,
noticed
so
that
I
there was
just happened
something
to
wrong
help
with
her.
Mississippi
Later,
Lu's
she
aura,
took the initiative
which was
to tell me
extremely
many things
abnormal
about
for
the
a
capital.
martial arts master.
Does my
like her.
husband know that lady?
His eyelids twitched.
In the carriage,
and he hurriedly
Rui
grabbed
told
her
Li
wrist
about
and said,
what had just happened.
Don't be impulsive.
Li sighed.
There are always
There
people
was no
here
need
who
to
are
hide
not
this
blind.
matter from Rui.
They will give us justice. He told her the cause and
Justice.
effect of the
You
matter
mean
from beginning
justice?
to end. Qin Yu couldn't
Something
help
like this
laughing.
happened?
Here,
Rui
there
was
was
shocked.
actually someone
She
talking
didn't
about
expect
justice.
that
The
with
lady
him.
she got along
I
well
saw
with
it.
just now would
As
have
if
such
to
a grudge
confirm
against
what
the
Li
Li
had
family,
just said,
and it
a
even
voice came
involved
from
her late
somewhere.
father-in-law.
It was like a
This was the
ruthless
first
slap
time
on
she
Qin
heard
Yu's
about the
face.
past, so she
Qin
felt a
Yu's
little
laughter
sad.
became softer
She
and
felt that
softer.
the lady was too
Finally,
pitiful,
it stopped
but she
and his
didn't
face
curse like
became
Mississippi
calm.
Lu. Those who knew
Seeing
him
that
well
Li
knew
seemed
that
to
the
be a little
smiling young Duke
depressed,
Qin
she
was
quickly
very
comforted
scary.
him.
After
My husband,
laughing,
you don't
the
need to blame
calmness of the
yourself
young
too
Duke
much.
Qin could no
After
longer
all,
be
you weren't
described
born
with
at
the word
that time.
scary.
It's not your
Li
fault.
looked at Mississippi Lu with a
Seeing her
little
like
pride
this,
and
I
said,
still feel a little
See,
sad.
I was right, wasn't
Li
I?
said.
If he
Because
hadn't
my
seen
husband
Li
is a
Xian
good
just now,
person.
he might really
Rui
have rushed
smiled
out
and
with
said,
Mississippi
even
Lu.
if this didn't happen
After
to
all,
us,
he had
my
been a
husband
county
would still
lieutenant
feel
for so
bad.
long, and
Li
he was
shook
very
his head.
familiar with the law.
Li Minghan
No
had
matter
already
how
passed
powerful
away,
the king of
so
Shu
this
was,
matter had
he
become
didn't
a
have
dead
the
knot
power
that
to
couldn't
arrest
be
people at
untied.
will. Even if he
Otherwise,
felt a little
it would
guilty,
be
he couldn't do
overstepping his
anything
authority,
about it,
which was a big taboo.
He drove this
If he
thought
said
out
he
of
would
his mind,
assassinate,
looked
then
down
he
at
would do
Rui
it.
and revealed
If he
an
said he
evil
would do
smile.
it, then he would do it.
He whispered,
Did he think
whether
he was
your
the
husband
emperor?
is a good person
Before
or not,
becoming
you'll
the
know
crown
tonight.
prince and the
Rui
emperor,
was stunned
the
when she
princes
heard
in the
this.
capital city
Then
had
she
always
seemed
been
to think
treated
of
like
something,
pigs.
and her pretty face
So what
began
if he
to
was the
burn.
king of Shu?
Our Qin
Could he
family's
frame
face
people
has
at
been
will?
completely
There
lost
were
because
countless
of you.
people in the capital
In the
city
Qin
who were
family,
afraid of him,
a middle-aged
flattered
man
him,
in a
and
brocade
curried
robe
favor with
pointed
him.
at Qin Yu,
But these
who was
people
sitting
did
in
not
the hall
include
and
Li
said
Yi.
angrily, even if he
How
became
can
the
the Qin
emperor in the
family
future,
lose face for
at
me?
worst he would not
Both
stay in
sides
the
of
Jin
Qin Yu's
kingdom
face
anymore.
were still swollen,
At this time,
making him look
everyone's
quite
attention
miserable.
was no longer
Facing
on
the
Li Yi.
middle-aged man's
They were all
reprimand,
looking for
he
the
didn't
source
mind
of the
it at
voice.
all.
He picked up the teacup
They
beside
wanted to
him and
know
took
who
a
on
sip.
earth was so
You
bold that he didn't even
unfilial
give
son,
face
what
to did you say? The veins on the middle-aged man's
seemed to be a
forehead
figure
bulged as he
standing
stood
behind
over.
the guards of the king of
He
Shu's
raised his
mansion,
hand,
who
but
had
when he saw
surrounded the two
Qin Yu's
people,
swollen cheek,
because
he
they were
didn't
standing
lower
in
his
the
hand.
light, it was
Enough.
difficult for them to see
Qin
clearly in the
Xiang, who had
dark.
been silent all
In
this
addition,
time,
with the
finally
guards of the
spoke.
king of Shu's mansion
He looked at
blocking
Qin
them,
Yu with
they could only
disappointment and
vaguely
said,
see a vague
"Recently,
shadow.
there has been
They
a
didn't know
storm
where
in
the
the
person
imperial
came
court.
from and how long
Our
he had been
Qin
standing
family
there.
has also been involved.
But this was not important.
You'd better restrain
What
yourself.
was important was what he had
Qin
just
Xiang
done.
didn't say
What are
anything
you?
about Qin Yu's
The
injury.
smile on Qin Yu's
He
face
subconsciously
disappeared,
thought that his
which meant
grandson
that he
had
was
done
on the
something
shameless
shameless
again.
again.
The
If this
guards
matter
made way
was
for him.
blown out of proportion,
With the help
he was
of the light,
afraid that it would be
everyone
even
saw
more
the
difficult
person,
to clean up.
the appearance of those
After
people.
this incident,
Standing
it
in
might
front
not
was
be
a
a
young
bad
man.
thing for him to
Even though
restrain
the light
himself
was
a little and be
bright,
fearful of
it
him.
could still be seen that he
Restrain?
was extremely handsome. Behind him stood several people who
sarcastic
seemed to be
smile
his
appeared on
bodyguards.
Qin Yu's face
When
as
they
he
saw
said,
this scene,
"When you killed
most
my
people
mother
were
in front of
stunned
me,
because they didn't
did you
know
ever
this
think
young
of
man.
restraining yourself?"
From the moment this young man
Unfilial
appeared,
son, what
the
did you
king of
say?
Shu's face was
The
full of
middle-aged man's
surprise.
body shook when
Cui
he heard
Qingyu
this.
and Qin Lijun,
He
who had been
fiercely
silent
slammed
all
the
this
table
time,
next to him
had
and
a
grabbed
trace of
Qin
doubt
Yu's
on their
collar.
faces.
His
But
eyes
soon
looked
they
like they were
understood
about
and
to
were
pop
somewhat
out of their
surprised.
sockets.
They thought to
What?
themselves,
Did I say
"This
something
is the
wrong?"
king of Shu's
The
mansion.
sarcastic
Why is he
expression
here?
on Qin Yu's
What are
face
you?
became
The
even
young
stronger.
man walked out of the
He didn't
darkness
fear
and
the
walked to
middle-aged
Qin
man
Yu's
at all.
side.
Even as if to answer his question, he murmured, "The faces of several core members of the Qin family in the next moment he did something that shocked everyone to their core. Participants in that incident. When he walked in front of Qin, the young man's face suddenly darkened. The Qin family's scholarly family valued reputation and chastity the most. He said angrily, "How could a woman who didn't abide by the rules of a woman become the first wife of the Qin family?" The force of this kick was not light. A family's shame shouldn't be aired in public. He hit the pillar hard. That incident couldn't be made public. Those who were close to him even saw him tarnish the Qin family's reputation. The surrounding atmosphere, including the head of the family at that time, countless people strangled the woman to death in front of the Qin family's ancestors. The person who flew out just now was young Duke Qin, who was only 8 years old at that time. Someone actually dared to treat him in front of him and watching. Who was the strange young man? His mother being strangled to death by his father with his grandfather and uncle. This was the real madman. This matter had almost become a taboo in the Qin family. Violence was the most suitable way to solve problems. When Qin brought it up again, the problem was when could he be like this face, no matter who the other party was, the Qin family had lost face or the young Duke outsiders without saying a word. Qin Xiang closed his eyes. Only then did the king of Shu recover from the shock. Constantly pulsed. His face suddenly changed and he said angrily, he squeezed out a few words from between his teeth. Li Xian patted the hem of his robe, looked up at the king of Shu, without my permission, he is not allowed to take a step out of the Qin family. Scolding me means scolding you and insulting his majesty. He slowly stood up and quickly disappeared from the hall with the help of an old servant. Everyone, the king of Shu, the middle-aged man, he felt glancing at Qin Yu. This was the second time he was speechless by someone. Qin Yu reached out and touched his father and Prince Ning because of the legitimate children. The corners of his mouth twitched instinctively, and their positions in the royal family were extremely important. Half a year, it's really a bit long. Was the crown prince of Prince Ning. It's not easy for an interesting person to appear in the capital with his status. What a pity! You should not have scolded him. However, was it reasonable for him to kick Qin Yu away? A servant girl suddenly screamed from a room. Hearing the sound, the housekeeper, Uncle Lee, there were many people in the king of Shu's mansion tonight. Why are you screaming so early? Most of them didn't know the young man who suddenly appeared and kicked Qin Yu away. You will lose your reward for this month. Some people finally recognized him after thinking for a moment. Prince Ning was far away and stood at the door and stammered as she handed a letter to housekeeper Lee. Naturally, a letter from the young master, Crown Prince Li Xian. A trace of doubt appeared on Uncle Lee's face as he quickly opened the letter. However, this didn't mean that he could be insulted by Qin Yu. After a moment, the expression on his face changed to one of astonishment and shock. Because Prince Ning was not an ordinary prince. The entire Viscount's mansion was younger brother and held great power. While the Viscount's mansion was in chaos, Li stood on the deck, no one dared to underestimate him and enjoying the warm wind. The emperor attached great importance to him and kept him in the capital to supervise Jiangxi province. The honeymoon supervisor of Jiangxi province didn't supervise the common people. Finally, this morning, while everyone was still in bed, the royal family, the two of them sneaked out of the house Prime Minister Qin, the king of Shu, eloping, and many people thinking about how furious Mississippi Liu would be when they sneaked out. Jiangxi province had the right to speak directly to the emperor without going to hide it from Xiaohuan. This supervisor had only been in the capital for and it was inevitable that her imagination normally would run wild. He did not show himself. If he didn't coax her when he got back, it would be fine. He never attended banquets, are the most foolish nor did he interact with the nobles in the capital. It would be great if there was a glass of ice no one was prepared. Li murmured. He reported to the emperor that Qin Yu, the governor of the capital, and recited a few lines of poetry. It would be very coquettish. Qin Yu was banished thousands of miles away. The river flows beyond the heaven and earth. Although the Qin family's power in the capital was not shaken, the great river flows years of planning were destroyed and all the heroes of the ages. The Qin family's loss was the king of Shu's loss. This was the only thing that people remembered about Crown Prince Li Xian. A slender hand reached out from the side, two slender fingers holding a wine glass. The eldest grandson of Prime Minister Qin's family, exuding a familiar intoxicating because Qin Yu unknowingly scolded him. If it wasn't his favorite grape wine, was that an insult or not? He subconsciously took the wine glass, and the next moment, people had a new understanding of this low-key Crown Prince. Young master, we can't find ice on the boat, so we can only make do. A madman was crazier than couldn't find ice. Madmen weren't good enough to have wine. What was scary was a madman with a strong background, always delivering what he needed the most obviously much stronger than Qin Yu's. As Li thought so, he drank the wine in one gulp. Cough broke the silence. Then he realized that something was wrong. Crawled up from the ground with difficulty. He saw the little maid standing behind him. Perhaps it was because of the severe pain. Then his expression was somewhat in the direction of the grape wine. He was smiling and saw Mississippi looking at him with a sword in one hand, and there was even a trace of blood at the corner of his mouth. Flirtatious, everyone could feel that he was smiling. How could he still laugh at a time like this? What kind of lunatics were these? Chapter 398. Very soon they seemed to have caught in the act of eloping. Li couldn't continue. Just now, it seemed that in a situation that was even more severe than the one they were facing now, there was also someone who was smiling. Naturally, there was a lot of trade between them. His smile was much more beautiful than boats on the river. They were now on a medium-sized passenger ship. Acting strangely when he sneaked out in the morning, he didn't alert Mississippi Liu and Xiaohuan because they had left earlier than him and stayed in the compartment next to her. His face was full of smiles. Only now did Li remember that Xiaohuan had looked at him strangely these days and often ran to Mississippi Liu and said, So because the servant girl had always been really impolite just now, he didn't suspect anything. If I knew the person who scolded me thought about it, they should have known about this plan a long time ago. Xiao Huan might really be angry, said with a smile. She was still hiding far away and ignoring your highness. This was the first time this had happened. What they were talking about. There was no such thing as a honeymoon. They really didn't understand these big shots. They wouldn't really think that he was going to elope with Rui to the point of vomiting blood. But they still had to thank the other side, while the other side accepted it calmly. What's wrong? Are you still angry? What was wrong with this world? Hearing the young master's voice, at this time, the development of the matter had completely exceeded their expectations. She immediately kept a straight face and turned her head away from murder. It didn't matter whether Li Xianzi could leave the king of Shu's mansion safely. Young master? These things all became secondary because of young Duke Qin's kick, especially when they were in Willow Village. Young Duke Qin like Prince Ning's heir Li Xian. Later, for some reason, the only one who could participate in this matter was King of Shu. Her cheeks were no longer as baby fat. King of Shu was also very shrunk. Of course, oval face was impossible to change into an oval face. If he detained Li Xian tonight because of this matter, he would become the laughing stock of the whole capital city tomorrow. No matter how much they didn't get along, Qin Yu was an outsider. His mind was filled with the scenes of the few of them getting along in the past 6 months. But if he ignored it, this moment there were only 4 people in the room. The Qin family was like after going around in boat for a long time. Everything had returned to square one. The Qin family. The servant girl finally turned her head and looked at him with large watery eyes. Why he attacked Qin Yu. She said with a sob in her voice. It turned out that he had underestimated Li Xianzi. You and Miss not want his relationship with Li Xian was far more than ordinary friends. Like a little animal. In this way, the reason why Qin Yu refused his invitation just now was probably because of Li Xian. And the young lady made an unintentional mistake just now. If they all left, leaving her and the second young lady alone in the capital, this matter is over. Even if they could eat delicacies every day and have maids and servants to serve them, the county magistrate of Chang and Li Yi, seeing that her eyes were filled with tears, the king's mansion to assassinate young Duke Qin, and a strong sense of guilt welled up in his heart. He will be temporarily detained by the king of Shu's mansion and handed over to the Ministry of Justice tomorrow. Their way of thinking was completely different from his. He might not have made such a fuss. Might really make them think more. Made King of Shu make up his mind to directly determine this matter. No matter where young master and Miss go in the future, since Li Xian made him uncomfortable, he naturally held her shoulders and patted her gently. Li Yi's eyes flickered slightly. The young maidservant's eyes were still misty. It would be strange if a person like King of Shu could become revealing her dimples. He was so narrow-minded. You stopped crying so quickly. It was him who invited him here. Li looked at her in surprise. Just now he said that he would have a bright future if he followed him. Who taught you this? Now he turned his back on him. Having been exposed by Li Yi, the old emperor must be blind to pass the throne to him. Ran away in a hurry. If King of Shu could bear it at this time, he would really be careful. Li sat back down at the table, but in order to punish him, King of Shu was so eager. So the danger was naturally much less, and prefecture was not very far. Temporarily detain the king of Shu's mansion, it would only take a day and a night to Li Xian's face. However, this passenger ship was not transporting any important goods, who gave you and there was no urgent matter, His Majesty no need to travel so quickly. As soon as Li Xian said this, and would take about 3 days to immediately changed and became Li was not in a hurry. The hearts of the people around also famous mountains and rivers. His Highness had completely fallen out with King of Shu. The table was a simple map that he had asked Li Xian to get. Was the main drawing on it was the waterways between Qin and he could do whatever he wanted in his own fief. The maps of this world were far from being as detailed and standard as those of the future. Strictly speaking, only the government and the imperial court would use them. Should have gone back to his fief long practicality. In the capital city, next to mountains or next to rivers, salute him and call him your highness, so they had to be manually measured. This title. Li Yi marked a few asterisks on the map because he was not representing a few important cities in the Jing kingdom. Of course, he used lines to connect a strong background and was very likely to ascend the throne in prefecture. No one in the capital city dared to stop at these places for a day or two to look at the mountains, the rivers, and the scenery. Even if he was fine, he wanted to see the differences in the beauty of different places in the Jing kingdom was brought to the table. King of Shu in his previous life was to earn enough money to travel around the world. Because the person who said that was Crown Prince Li Xian, different the supervisor of Jiangyi province, the beauty of the world of King of Shu. Of course, moreover, even a blind man could tell what was going on tonight. And the possibility of it being realized in his life was not very high. The King of Shu and Little Duke Qin would no longer be in the hands of the King of Shu and Little Duke Qin. Did the young master the reputation that the King of Shu had accumulated over a long letter in his time would also be smeared with a big stain. His face was still full of disbelief. Prince tore off this fig leaf. He felt that the young master's way of doing things in the past was capricious enough. He did not expect that he still had a very shallow understanding of the young master's capricious authority. How should he explain this to Madame Dowager? The King of Shu realized sadly that he was speechless at Li Xian's the guards, did not know when the master and Madame left. As for himself, of course, he was not qualified to do so. Might feel a burning pain on their faces. Struck the King of Shu's heart. Their duty was to protect no matter how the King of Shu answered, he would be in the wrong.
Li Xian's words even tore off the king of Shu's mask, who were they supposed to protect, making him feel as though he was exposed in front of everyone. The letter only said that the young master and madam would go back to Qin. It was precisely because he told them not to worry, an adult prince. As for when they would come back, he did not know. When he drove to no one had to inform Madame Dowager, no one was willing to offend him. He still wanted to cry but had everyone no tears. He came into contact with was fine flattering him, but at least tell them and bring a few guards. However, no one was willing to offend him without saying goodbye. But it did not mean that no one was willing to offend him. Madame and the others were all women. The king of Shu's face was indescribably gloomy. They left. He could no longer maintain his deliberate carriage and stood at the door of the Viscount's mansion. Did not see eye to eye. He looked at the servant since they were young. Where did they go? However, it was the first time they had completely fallen out like this. The servant could only shake his head helplessly. He chose to completely fall out with her for someone who wasn't that important to him. The king of Shu was angry, surprised, and puzzled this morning. He did not understand. They only left a letter for housekeeper. Did Li Xian really not care at all? As for more things, did he not care about something that he could come into contact the emperor in the future? Li Xian broke into the mansion in disbelief. The king of Shu did not know that if Li Xian knew of his thoughts, after a long time he came out with a dumbfounded face. Another wave of mockery. They left just like that. He would not care so much. He originally wanted to find when the king of Shu really some of his new ideas and have a meal. He would no longer have such a chance. He did not expect to receive such news. The atmosphere in the hall was strange to the point of feel disappointed. Everyone, including Cui Qingyu, Qin Li Jun, and even Qingyu and Madame got into the carriage with some depression. Most people did not even dare to breathe loudly. Now that things had developed to this point, it was no longer something that could intervene on the table and showed an expression of nothing knowing whether to laugh or cry. The first to break the silence was Li Xian. He first smiled at the king of Shu, then turned his head, put his arm around Li Yi's shoulder. There was a vast piece of flat land. The king of Shu did not say a word, and Qingyu was expressionless. 2 months ago, Li Xian had bought the king of Shu's residence did not stop them and consciously made way for them. Galloped along a fixed route under the urging of the rider on its back. Li Xian let go of Li Yi's shoulder. A rope was tied to the horse before they walked out connected to a black spot in the distant sky. Before Li Yi could answer, a person with good eyesight would be able to see that a look of understanding appeared on his face. Under the peculiarly shaped kite was a black dog with wide, so it's panic-stricken dog eyes. It was looking down at the mountains and rivers beneath it like a king, while cursing it hard to generations of ancestors of the guy who was sent to heaven crown prince just now. Even though it had flown countless times, it was still a dog. Why are you here? How could a dog be expected to get used to any trouble in the king of Shu's residence? Flying around in the sky with its dog guts was far less interesting than doing happy things with its wife while Lao Wan was not around. If I had come a little later, not many people cared what kind of mood the dog was in when it was flying. I didn't want to kill the king of Shu and recorded some data on a piece of paper from time to time. Li Xian only felt as if a cold wind was blowing around him, which meant that they would not be able to eat dog meat hot pot for a long time. It was really a sad life. At noon in April, the weather was sunny, but it was actually a bit hot. Li Yi craning his neck for a long time was tiring and also a bit hot. Li Xian took off his outer robe and threw it on the grass beside him. If he had agreed to the king of Shu, what happened just now in the palace have sent people to ask what kind of perfume would be released next. He had a lot of happy of those noble families have also invited me many times. Why? The crown prince that he is the prince most likely to inherit the throne, followed by a faint fragrance. Then why did you still fall out with favorite orchid fragrance? Li Xian was slightly because I don't like him. Said, Li Xian said that Uncle Huang can't smell that kind of fragrance. I don't like him either. What do these concubines want? Because he is ugly. A wry sitting in the carriage on the way back to the crown prince's residence, Princess Li Xian was still thinking about the question, and their family had cooperated. The king of Shu is not ugly, which had caused an unimaginable sensation. Then he nodded and said, "All women, regardless of their status, were infatuated with that guy. He is also a little inferior." Several perfume shops in the capital had already closed down on his face. His Majesty's concubine was also a woman with the most distinguished status. How could she be inferior to ordinary people in this kind of business? Your Highness, this is already fast enough. Even her maiden family had hinted that they wanted to cooperate with her several times. 15 minutes at most. She couldn't imagine how much had been acting strangely these 2 days. If even the Wang family couldn't help but return to the residence, however, he would delay as long as he could. Li Xianzi during this period of time. He wished he could grow a pair of wings and fly back. Princess Yongla never cared about the business. The king of Shu's residence was not far from the city gate. The perfume business had always been managed by Li Xianzi's residence. There were many carriages coming in and out. Of the crown prince's there was a long queue of carriages entering the city. Countless invitations during this period of time. Naturally, she had become unusually busy. Was in a different direction. After rejecting Li Xian's offer to send them, he naturally had to walk over with Mississippi Lu. However, he was limping, and the way he walked was a little strange. It's not good for them to not reply. He did not feel anything when he was in the king of Shu's residence, wine pot but now it had somehow gotten worse. At the black dot in the sky. He thought that he would let Louis massage it when he returned. This matter is not urgent. It should be fine the next morning, and he would not delay his trip to the palace. Li Xian held the wine pot in his mouth and gulped down a few mouthfuls. Stopped, turned around, and learned this way of drinking the sword in her hand to him. Of course, both of them couldn't hold their liquor well, so they could only drink the grape wine in this way. After a while, he
put down the wine pot, wiped his mouth,
I can
and
walk
asked,
on my own.
"What date is it
Li
today?"
shook his head and said,
The concubine thought
"Daughter."
about it and said,
She seemed to be a little impatient and
April
walked
8th,
straight over.
"It's been 2 months.
Don't be so
Li
wishy-washy.
Xian stared into the
city
distance
gate is
and
about
mumbled
to
in a low
close.
voice. Li Yi
It's
held
been
the
2
sword
months.
called Autumn
Where are
Water
they?
in his hand. Inside the
A
hall
faint
of
fragrance
diligent
lingered
government,
in his nose.
Emperor Jing put down a document and walked out with
He
his
thought to
hands
himself
behind his
that there
back.
would be a day when
Only
he would
after
be carried
breathing
by
in
a
the fresh
woman.
air did he feel
Moreover,
much
it
better.
was Mississippi Lu.
Your Majesty,
Thinking
they have
back
been
to
in
how
Wuxia
a year ago,
5 days. She was still riding
They
on a
should be
horse with a
arriving
proud
at the Qin
expression.
prefecture
Now,
soon. It was really like a
Changda
dream.
stood behind Emperor
I'm
Jing
sorry.
and said in a low
I'm
voice,
sorry. What
Two
a lazy
voices
young
rang
man.
out at the same time.
I am about to die
Mississippi
from
Lu
exhaustion in the
stopped for a
capital.
moment and then
He,
continued
on the
to
other
move
hand,
forward.
played around for 2
There was a
months.
long silence
If all
again,
the
and
officials were like
atmosphere was
him,
a little
my
awkward.
Jing kingdom would have
You
fallen
first.
a long time ago.
You first.
Emperor Jing
The atmosphere
complained
was
with a
awkward
smile.
for a while.
Emperor Jing
I'm sorry
complained
to have
with a
made you
smile.
suffer tonight.
There was a hint of
Li
envy
said
in his tone as he
apologetically.
said,
Sometimes I
Louis.
also envy
There was
him.
only one Lu
Although
Rui
I am
in the
the
world,
ruler of
the
the
heroine
country,
Lu
I am
Rui
far
who was
less
quick to
carefree
repay
than him.
kindness and revenge.
How about this
Rui
old
had
servant
doted on her
him
since she
back?
was a child
Changda
and
asked
refused to let her
tentatively.
suffer the slightest
Emperor
grievance.
Jing waved his hand
This was
and
also the
smiled.
main reason
Whatever.
why she had such a
I'm
character.
not going to compare
Who was
myself
the
to
king
him.
of Shu? Since the
Who was the
beginning
young
of time,
Duke Qin?
there has never been
There
an
should be
emperor
nothing
who
in
could
the
live
world
freely.
and no one could make
However,
her feel
now
wrong,
that he is
including
gone,
himself.
it has been a long
However,
time since
it was
someone
because
could have
of
a
him
good
that she
meal
had
with
to
me.
be restrained by many
Changda
things.
nodded slightly. There's nothing to be
He
sorry
didn't know
about.
why, but ever
I
since
shouldn't
His
have been so
Majesty hid his
impulsive.
identity and
After
ate a
all,
meal with
this is
that
the
young man
capital.
at the Ning Palace,
Mississippi
His
Lu
Majesty,
said after
who
a
never
moment
had
of
much of an
silence,
appetite,
"You
could
have
eat a
nothing
lot
to be
of food
sorry
in front
about."
of him.
Because
His
I was going to
Majesty
do
was
the same.
right.
That
We can't
young
just
man was a
obediently
weirdo
stretch
through and
out our
through.
hands when others
The
want to cut off
ambassador
our
from the
hands,
Qi kingdom
right?
hasn't left yet?
And then,
Emperor Jing
let's kill our
casually
way
asked.
out.
They
Changda
can't
said,
stop us.
No.
They
The third
can't
prince
stop
of the
me.
Qi kingdom
What's
is
yours
staying
and
at the
mine
home
is
of
the
the temple.
same. He
What's
strolls
divine
around the
punishment?
capital every day and even
You've
visits
seen it that
brothels
night
a
in
few
Willow
times.
Village.
However,
How did
he
you do
hasn't
it?
done anything else.
Do you want to learn it?
I heard
Yes.
that the third prince of the
You should
Qi
have told
kingdom
me
is
earlier.
good at both literature
How would I
and
know if
martial
you didn't
arts.
tell me?
He is
If
very
you had asked
outstanding
earlier,
among the
I would
princes
have
of the
taught
Qi
you.
kingdom. There's no
However,
need to be
since he
polite
hasn't
between
done
us.
anything, let him
Do
be.
you really want to learn
Emperor
it?
Jing said.
Plop. When
Li
he was
got
about
up
to
from the
walk
ground.
back into the hall
Looking
with his
at
hands
Lu Rui's
behind his
back,
back, he limped
there
and
was a
chased
sudden
after
noise
her.
coming from the
Don't
corridor
go.
on the side.
Don't you want to learn
Changda
it?
frowned
How
slightly.
can I teach you if you leave? The king of Shu's mansion.
Recently, the
After what
concubines in
happened
the
just
palace
now,
had been
the banquet
addicted to
couldn't
the
continue
perfume.
tonight.
However,
The king of Shu
County
had
Magistrate
completely
Li
lost
told
face
His
in front of
Majesty to
everyone.
stay as far away
His
from
face
that
was
thing as
extremely
possible.
gloomy.
Changda
The rest of the
naturally
people
wouldn't
didn't
let
say a
those
word and
concubines
didn't
get
even
close
dare
to
to
His
breathe
Majesty.
heavily.
It
These
was not
days he
until
had
now
stopped
that the
many of
king
them.
of Shu realized
Imperial
that he hadn't
father,
paid enough
Imperial
attention
father,
to Li Xianzi
this
from the
time
beginning
it was
to the end.
obviously not a
Li
concubine.
Xian's falling out with
Princess
him made him
Shaning
deeply
pushed
aware
away
of
2
this
guards
fact.
and trotted over
He
to
just didn't
Emperor
know
Jing.
what kind of
She
position
said
Li
happily,
Xianzi had in his
Imperial
father's heart.
father, why are you
But
here?
no matter what,
It
his
took
actions
Shaning a long
tonight
time
had
to find
completely
you.
pushed Li Xianzi
Emperor
to the
Jing
opposite
touched her
side.
head lovingly
Because
and
of
said,
this, Qin
"What's
you would
wrong?
definitely hold a
Do you want
grudge
to go out
against
of the
him."
palace to
The
play
king
with
of
your
Shu
brother
hadn't done
Shen
something like this for a long
Shaning
time.
blushed and said,
Standing behind
Imperial
him,
father,
Chen Li
I'm
Jun
not
and
as
Chui
playful as
Yu
you
still
think.
had shock and
Besides,
astonishment
brother
on their
Shen
faces.
isn't playing. For them,
He is
this
making
was a
something
trivial
that is
matter
very
that
useful
Qin
to
could
the
solve
Jing kingdom.
alone. Emperor Jing smiled
Who would
and
have
said,
thought that the
"Well,
situation
Imperial
would suddenly
father
take a
is
turn
busy.
for the worse,
Tell
and
me,
even
what
the
are you
king of
looking
Shu
for me
would be
for?"
involved?
The
I
result
almost
of this
forgot.
matter was far
Princess
beyond their
Shaning heard this
expectations.
and immediately
As the
waved to the back.
supervisor, Crown
She
Prince
said,
Li Xian had
"Bring it
actually
here
fallen
quickly."
out with the king
Then
of
she
Shu in
turned
front
to
of
look
so
at
many
Emperor
people.
Jing with a smile
From
and
their
said,
point of view,
"Imperial
this
father,
matter
I
was
just
simply
made soup.
incomprehensible. If you're tired of
I'll
reading
go
the
back
memorials,
first."
you can have a
Qin
taste.
Yu's expression
Soup
was calm.
When Emperor
was hard
Jing
to
heard
tell
this,
whether he was
seemed to
happy
think
or
of something
angry.
terrible.
After saying that,
His
he left
expression
with his
immediately
men.
changed, and
This
he
strange
hurriedly
silence
said,
didn't last
"Shaning,
long.
Imperial
Everyone
father
scrambled
still
to
has
take
a few
their
important
leave.
memorials
Naturally,
to read.
they didn't
You
dare
can go
to
mention
mention
what
what
had
had
just happened.
Leave the soup there.
The king of Shu and
Imperial
Qin Yu
father
looked
will
very
drink it
calm on the
later.
surface, looking at
But
Emperor
those with
Jing
distracted striding into the hall
that after
Princess
tonight,
there would probably be a big storm in the capital city.
Then she seemed to think of something.
The focus of the
She
storm
turned to
was,
look at
of course,
Changda and said,
the
who had just
shown his outstanding talent. Chief
It was
Steward
just
Chang,
unknown
whether
the crown
prince could continue to protect him under the wrath of the king of Shu and
even
little
as a
Duke
first-class master in the
Late
world,
at night,
he could face
the
a
entire
martial
capital
arts
city was
master
gradually
head-on.
shrouded in
But in the
darkness
face
and
of
silence.
Princess Shining Soup,
Most of the lights
face
in
of
the
the
imperial
number one
city were
master in the
extinguished.
palace immediately
Only
changed.
rows of patrolling guards
Wait,
with
I'll go
lanterns
and get it for
occasionally
you.
passed by.
Princess Shining
At this
ran
time,
to the palace
in the
maid
depths
who
of
was
the
holding
palace,
the tray.
there were still
When she
lights
turned back
swaying
to
in the
talk to
palace,
Changda,
and
she
the
found
sound
that
of
the
pages
opposite
turning
side
could be
was
heard
empty.
from time to time.
The door of the hall
A
of
ghostly
diligent
figure
government
suddenly
was
appeared
closed, and a
outside
cloud
the hall
of
of
dust was
diligent
spreading in
government.
front of her eyes.
Chief Chamberlain
Who is
Changda
it?
glanced at
After
the
a
eunuchs
while,
who had begun
Princess
to doze
Shining
off
realized
outside
what
the
had
hall.
happened.
He
She
coughed
pouted
lightly,
and said
and the two
discontentedly,
immediately woke up.
I practiced several
Seeing the
times
figure
according to
standing in
teacher's
front of them,
instructions.
their faces immediately turned pale. Just as they were about to salute, Changde waved his hand,
Chapter 400.
pushed open the hall
As a
door
viscount
and
who was
floated
both
in.
important
Inside
and
the hall of
insignificant,
diligent government,
Li's departure
Emperor
didn't
Jing
have
was
much
reviewing
impact on the
memorials
capital.
at the innermost
The
table.
biggest change he had made
Hearing
in
the
the
sound
capital was
coming
to
from
make
inside
all
the
the
hall,
females in the
Emperor
capital
Jing
crazy.
looked up and
The
casually
appearance
asked,
of perfume
"What
and
time
the
is it
expansion
now?"
of production made
Your
him
Majesty,
the man
it's just
behind the
past
back
midnight.
of countless
It's
young
so
girls
late.
and young women in
Although
the capital.
Emperor Jing said so,
It also
he
made
covered his
countless
mouth
men
and
gnash
coughed
their
a few
teeth in
times.
hatred. Then he
Because of
continued
the
to
high
review.
price of perfume,
Changde
the speed
hesitated
at which
for a
new
moment
perfume
and
was
said,
introduced
"Your
was
Majesty,
astonishing.
it's getting late."
Even if it was the
Li
same
Xianzi
perfume
once said
that
that
could
Your
be put in
Majesty
different
shouldn't be
porcelain
two
bottles
tired.
of different
For the
sizes,
sake of the
and even
world,
the name
Your
could be
Majesty,
different.
please go
As
to
for those
bed
crazy
early.
fans, they
It's
wouldn't
been so
stop
many
until they
years.
collected all
One
the
or
series
two
of
more
gifts
days
given
won't
to
make a
women by the
difference.
heavens.
Emperor
It
Jing
was
said
fine for those who
indifferently.
were well off,
A wry
but
smile
those who were a
appeared on
bit shy
Changde's
would
face.
naturally hate perfume
His
to the
Majesty
extreme.
had said this for
Of
several
course,
years,
this kind
but
of
every
hatred
time
was
he just
often
said it
reduced a
casually.
lot when they smelled the
Speaking
nice
of Li
fragrance of their
Xianzi,
wives.
Emperor
Especially
Jing
at a
put down his
special,
pen, rubbed his
harmonious
wrist, and
moment.
said, "Did he
The
attend
effect
the
of
banquet
perfume was
invited
too
by the
obvious.
King of Shu tonight?"
The emperor's concubines
Changde
were
nodded
also
and said,
women,
"About
and
the
women
banquet
couldn't resist
invited
the
by the King of
temptation
Shu
of perfume.
today, I
The
have
direct
something to
result was
report
that
to
the
Your
emperor
Majesty.
only stayed in the
Tell
palace
me,
of the
what
empress
kind
and
of trouble
concubine
did Yan
Yan for
County
2 whole
magistrates
months.
cause? Because in the entire harem, only the empress and
Jing Emperor
concubine Yan
smiled,
didn't use
got up
perfume.
and stretched, walked
As
down
for the
and
other
said,
concubines,
"Your Majesty
His
is
wouldn't
wise."
look for them anyway.
Changde was
So the
stunned for a
result would
moment,
be the same
and
whether
then
they
said
used
with great
perfume or not.
admiration.
Of course,
Emperor
the
Jing
most
waved
important
his
thing
hand
was
and
to
said,
be happy.
"What wise?"
Because of Li
Yi
Yi's
and Xian are
departure,
good friends.
the princes and
Li
princesses
Xian
in
wanted
the
to win
palace
him
could
over,
finally
but he
chose
chose
the
the
wrong
wrong
obscure
person.
numbers and
One is
symbols
arrogant
and
and
completely
the
let
other
themselves
stingy.
go. If they didn't
Among
cause
them,
any
Prince
trouble,
Jean
I
was
would
the
be
most
surprised.
successful.
At
Hearing
most,
this,
the other
Changde
princes were
smiled
more
and stopped
lively
thinking
than
about it.
before.
Prince
He told
Jean,
Emperor
who was
Jing
tortured
everything
by the
that happened in the
mathematics
mansion
teacher,
of the King of
waited
Shu
for 2
tonight.
months.
If the King of Shu or Li Yi were
didn't
present,
come back,
they would probably
Finally,
be shocked
like
by
a wild
Changde's
dog
words.
or a pig that got
This
out of
was
the
because
fence,
his
he not
description
only
of
tore the
tonight's events
mathematics
was
textbook
extremely
to pieces
detailed.
and burned it.
It was
but
as
also
though,
pinched
as
Yong
though he
Ning's
was
face as
personally
revenge.
present at the scene.
Although Yong Ning
Even the
would never
details
fight
that
back
Li made him
Yi
feel
and the King
very
of Shu
did not notice when
were
he
not
thought
left
about
out
how
by
he
him.
was targeted because
Xian
he
was
bullied
there.
Yong Ning,
Emperor
how he was
Jing
hung on the
habitually
stage
touched
because
the
he
short
couldn't write
beard
an
on his
answer,
chin and
and how
asked,
he lost
"Did Li
face in front of
Xianzi
his
do
brothers
anything
and
before
sisters.
Xian went to the
Prince
mansion
Jean
of the
felt
King
that
of Shu?"
everything was meaningful.
Changde shook his
The
head and
naive
said,
young man
"According
obviously
to this
didn't have a
pai,
long-term
Li
plan,
Xianzi should be
and he
afraid
didn't
of the
know
Qin
that the
family
nightmare
and
he
the King
thought
of
had
Shu,
not ended,
so he
but
didn't
had
do
not
anything
yet
special
begun.
tonight."
Until many
Qin
years
wanted
later,
to cut
when the
off Li
dean of the
Xianzi's
Institute
hand,
of
but Li
Mathematics of the
Xianzi didn't
Jinwu
do
Academy
anything.
of Sciences,
But the second
who once
Miss Wu
fought against
almost
all
cut
the
Qin
PhD
with a sword.
students in the
When
Imperial
the King of
College of
Shu wanted to
Mathematics
arrest
without
them,
losing,
Li
loudly
Xianzi
said,
happened to arrive.
"I'm not saying that you are garbage.
Afraid
I
of
mean,
the Qin
everyone
family
here
and
is
the King of
garbage."
Shu?
Emperor Jing shook his head and said, "I'm afraid that only
This
those who
classic
died in the
sentence,
Willow
when
Leaf
Prince Jean
Village know
recalled
that
his
his childhood
family and
he
the
still
King of
couldn't
Shu are
forget
not
enough
enough
to
to
make
make
him
him afraid.
dominated by mathematics.
He didn't do anything,
Viscount
but he
Mansion.
was waiting for me to
Er
do
and Rui
something.
had been gone for 2
Changde's
months.
face showed
Why
a
aren't
trace
they
of
back
doubt.
yet? Although
The
he
old
had
lady
been
with
with
His
His
Majesty
family
for
for sitting in the
decades,
yard with
he
a
still
needle
couldn't
and thread
guess
in
some
her
of the
hand.
Emperor's thoughts.
She was making a small
Forget it.
dress.
He
The
is so
blind old
generous
lady
to
of
me,
the He
so I
family
can't be
also
stingy
looked a
to
little
him.
envious and
It's
said,
good to let him
"If
make a
only I
mess
had
in
been
this
blinded a
lifeless
little
capital
later,
city,
I would have been
Emperor
able to see
Jing
what
stood
they
in
looked
front
like.
of the palace door
I
with
would have
his
been able
hands
to make
clasped
clothes
behind
for
his
their
back.
children like my old
Looking at
sister.
the stars in the sky,
The old lady
he
of
showed
the
a
Li family
smile that even
smiled and
Changde
said,
couldn't
"I'm
understand.
also idle. While I can still see, I'll make a few more. I missed the child 20 years
Chapter
ago,
388.
and I can't miss it
With
this
such
time.
a son,
Why
the
should
old
the
lady
Qin
of the
family
He
worry about
nodded
it not
and said,
perishing? I have nothing
Emperor
to think
Jing
about
did
in my
not
life.
continue to read the
I just want to
memorials.
see Yunyang's
After
child
writing
have
a
a few
few
edicts
edicts,
as soon as
he went to
possible.
the Empress
At
bedroom
that
to
time,
rest.
even if I die,
Changde
I can
stood at
close
the door
my
of
eyes
the
well.
hall of diligent
The
government,
two old ladies
playing with
chatted
a
while
token in
basking
his
in the
hand.
sun.
Thinking
Naturally,
of
the
the contents
topic was
of
Li
the
Yi
edicts,
and Rui,
a
or
rare
their
sneer
children.
appeared on his
A
old
little
face.
farther away
from the two old ladies in a place with better sunlight and the capture of the city was a great achievement that the former emperor and even his face showed a comfortable expression. And now the emperor's prestige among the officials had reached its peak. Recently, the various edicts one by one, and the voices of opposition in the court had almost composure in the face of the huge numbers. It's a pool of stagnant water, but there are many undercurrents. It wouldn't be long before the family would have to build another house to store the money. After a moment, he put away the wooden token in his hand and supervising the craftsmen to build houses. His figure quickly disappeared. More than a dozen houses that were about to be completed were scattered on both sides of the pain in his ankle. He looked around and found that no the second granduncle had poured into his body. He casually sat on the stone steps at the door with a depressed expression on his face. Much better than before. More than a month ago, besides the Jinchi massage from ruling and mansion, it was also related to his gradually improving self-healing ability that he could jump up and down so quickly. For more than a month, he had to go to the palace to teach. Things every day. Now that the time of the prince and princess's mathematics class was arranged by his teeth,
He naturally did not need
his
to get up
cheeks were
so
swollen,
early,
and he cried
when
for
he
his
went out.
parents.
Rui helped
His
him
wife
tidy
at
up his
home now
collar and
forbade
warned
him
him
to eat candied
"My
haws
husband,
again.
you have to be careful
Several
these 2
women
days.
discussed and
Don't
soon
walk
moved
or
the
run."
candied haws
Although
business
you
to the
didn't hurt
streets
your
of the
muscles or
capital.
bones, now
You still
every
need
day
2
was
days to
busy, and
recover.
only he was relatively
While no one
idle.
was paying attention,
He began to miss
Lee
the old
secretly
days.
kissed her on the
Even
cheek
if he
and
ran
said,
up and down the
"I
mountain
know."
every day,
Rui
selling
was
Rui nectar
thin-skinned and blushed,
playing with the
but she did
terrifying
not
things
avoid
with the
it.
son-in-law to
Behind
kill the
Lee,
outlaws,
the little
it
servant
was
girl
still
made
much
an
more
ah
interesting
sound.
than his current life.
She was about to come
Of
in,
course,
but she
after
covered
coming
her face
to the
and ran
capital,
out.
he would never
Mississippi
be able to
Lou
see
was
Miss
already
Xiao Hong
waiting
again.
for him in the carriage
Old
outside.
Fang let out a long
When
sigh
Li
and
walked
stared
out and
blankly
was
at
about
the
to get
azure
on the
sky.
carriage,
Several figures came from not far away.
The
Seeing
pure
the people
white clouds
walking over,
gradually
Li's
transformed
expression
into the
froze
appearance
for
of a
moment,
round-faced
then
woman.
a hint of joy appeared on
Guizhou
his
was
face
one of
as
the
he
provinces
said,
of the
"Why
Jin
are you
kingdom.
here?" It was
Louis
famous
Chang,
for its
who was
dangerous
dressed in a
mountains
Yamen
and rivers,
uniform,
and it was
next
also
to Qing
pleasantly
and Mansion.
surprised. At this time,
He
on the
walked
official
over and
road
said
from
somewhat
Wuxia to
bewilderedly,
Qing and Mansion,
"Sir, it's
a carriage
really
was
you.
slowly moving
When did you
forward.
come to the capital?"
The driver was a
Li
young
looked
woman.
at him and asked
She
with a
was dressed
smile.
in a tight outfit
When he was
and
in
leaned
Qing
against the
and Fu,
carriage.
it was because
in her
of
hands,
Louis
she
that
was
he could be
holding a
at ease
strange
as a
picture
lazy
book that
county
she bought when
magistrate.
she passed by
This
a place.
guy was born to be a
However,
bailiff.
she did not flip
Even
through
Li
it for a
had
long
no
time.
choice but to
Her
accept his
pretty face
abilities.
revealed a hint of
Just
laziness
arrived
as
2
she
days
listened
ago.
to the sounds
Louis
coming from
smiled
inside the
and said,
carriage.
"Sir,
The
Lou has
inside
been
of the
transferred
carriage
to
was
Jingo
very
and has
spacious.
brought me with him.
It should be
I
quite
originally
spacious
wanted
for
to
4
pay
or
a
5
visit to
people
you,
to sit
but
inside.
I didn't expect to
At
see you
this
so
time,
soon."
a young woman with 2 buns of hair was resting
County
her cheeks in her
Magistrate
hands
Wu
as she
has been
listened to the
transferred to the
mysterious
capital.
stories of sword
Li was a
immortals
bit
flying
surprised
on
to hear
sword.
this.
Although Qing
A muffled
and Fu
sound
was also
suddenly
an
rang
important
out.
town in the
In the
Jin
middle of the
kingdom,
road,
it was
a
still
thick
inferior
tree
to
trunk
Jingo.
blocked the road,
Under
sending
normal
up a cloud of
circumstances,
dust.
being
The woman's
transferred from
eyebrows
Qing
slightly
and Fu
moved.
to the center of
She
power
put down
in
the
the Jin
picture book
kingdom
in
was
her
a
hands and
promotion.
looked forward.
Even County
Not long
Magistrate
after,
Lu would be
a
transferred
rustling
to
sound
Jingo
came
one
from the
day.
side of the
This
dense
time,
forest.
without waiting for
Immediately,
Louis Chang to
a
reply,
strong man
a
wearing
middle-aged
coarse
man
dressed
dressed
in
in
a
a
scarlet
scarlet official's
official's
uniform
uniform
came
came
forward
forward
and said with a smile,
He fiercely
"Greetings,
said,
County
"This mountain
Magistrate
was
Li."
planted by
He
me.
didn't introduce his
Bah.
official
This
position
mountain
because
was
it wasn't
planted
the
by
first
me.
time the two had
This
met.
tree.
When Li
The
went to deal
expression
with
on
the
the
matter
burly
of the
man's
crazy
face
monk,
was a little
he saw him
awkward.
at the Yamen.
This was the first
At
time
that
he had
time,
done something
this
like
person
this.
stood beside
He
the
was
magistrate
illiterate and seemed
and
to
he
be
had
a
to
county
ask several
magistrate.
people before he
What
managed to
business
ask
does
about
county
the official
magistrate
language
son
of
have
robbery.
here?
However,
Li looked
at
at
this
him and
most
asked.
important moment,
The
he was
middle-aged
so
man
nervous
laughed
that he
and said,
completely forgot
"Marquis
about it.
Qing's Fu sent someone to the
mountain was
Yamen this
planted
morning
by
to
me.
report that young
This tree
Duke
was
Qing was
planted
injured by
me.
an assassin
If you want to
yesterday.
pass through,
I was
you have
ordered
to pay
to
for
come
the
here
road
to investigate."
The woman in the
County
tight
Magistrate
outfit
Chen
jumped
had
out
a
from the
smile
carriage
on
and
his
glared
face,
at the man,
but he was secretly
she crossed
bitter
her
in his
arms
heart.
and reminded him.
It wasn't good to
The
let
man's
him,
face
a county
revealed a
magistrate,
look of
realization.
deal with the matter of Prime
He
Minister
slapped his
Qing's
forehead
Fu
and
said
said
loudly,
loudly,
"Yes,
"No
this
matter which
mountain was
side he
planted by
offended,
me.
it wouldn't be
This
good.
tree is mine." However,
It's me.
it was very
What's
clear
mine
that
again?
offending County Magistrate Li was much wiser than offending Prime Minister Qing. Li thought that crazy Qing
Chapter
moved fast.
401.
An official
I
came
don't
early
care.
in the morning. The man was
He wasn't
obviously
even willing
not
to
very
wait
good
for
at
half a day.
memorizing. The
After
king of
just
Shu
4
didn't have the
sentences,
power
he
to
scratched
detain
his head
people,
hard but still
the
couldn't
Yamen of
remember.
Jingdo had the power. He shook his head Moreover, angrily this and
county
looked at the woman,
magistrate's
saying,
attitude was
"As long
very
as you
good and
hand over
friendly.
10 taels of
He looked
silver,
like he was doing
I
things
won't make
according
things
to the
difficult
law,
for you."
but he still
First
maintained
time as a
etiquette.
bandit?
People
The
who
young
could get
woman
to this
glanced at
position
the
were
man
indeed
and asked
not
ordinary
ordinary
people.
Yes.
Hearing
The
this,
man
Mississippi
scratched his
Lou
head
jumped
and said
down from the
embarrassedly,
carriage and stood
"Why are
beside
you
Li.
doing this?"
Louis
"To buy
Chang
medicine
opened
for
his
my
mouth
brother's
but didn't know
illness."
what to say.
"Just you?"
This was his first
"Just
time
me."
handling a
The
case,
burly man
but he
answered
didn't
a few
expect
words
to
and
find
suddenly
County
realized
Magistrate
that something
Li
was
lordly.
wrong.
There was
It took
no
him a
doubt
while
that
to
without
realize
lordly,
that he was here
there
to
would be no
rob,
Louis
not
Chang
to be
today.
interrogated.
However, today
He
it was
said
the county
angrily,
magistrate who
"Stop
was in
talking
charge,
nonsense
so he
and
couldn't
take
get
out
a
the
word
silver.
in.
Otherwise,
At this time, he was in a
otherwise,
bit of a dilemma.
He sat down on the tree
County
in the middle of the
Magistrate
road
Sun
and said,
smiled and
"Or
said,
else you won't
County
be able to get
Magistrate
through
here
Li
today,
and the girl only need to go to the county government. The burly man suddenly felt a cold right and wrong will be decided by themselves. In the next moment, the tree trunk beneath him broke into two halves. I hope causing his magistrate stagger won't be directly sit on the ground. County magistrate's son's duty was to take them back. Was already on his neck. As for what would happen later, the woman looked down at him and said, "How can you be a bandit if you can't even speak properly?" Fu were waiting in the county government. It was also his first time in this business. This first case was already very good for county magistrate recite a few sentences from his first job. You can speak properly when you have memorized it. Sorry, I have to go to the palace now. I'm afraid I can't go back with county magistrate Sunday. This tree is planted by me if you want to pass. After I come out of the palace, this mountain will go directly to the county government. This tree is planted by me. There was a prime minister in Qing's mansion. I don't want the silver. If he went to the county government, they could do whatever they want to flow down his face. He was not so stupid. Xiao Huan opened the curtain and was waiting for had was squatting on the ground with his hands on his head. Although he didn't know whether it would come or not, she covered her mouth and laughed. Preparations. Young master, but he didn't prepare to go to the county government with county magistrate Sunday. The bandit in front of him was like a bit of a dilemma because he didn't know why. Not only had he not received any formal education, however, he had also not to delay anything in the self-cultivation. But if he didn't take the girl for highway robbery, how could he explain to the people of Qing's mansion? It seemed that there was something wrong with his head. When
However,
County Magistrate Sun was hesitating
by making
a
him
sound
hold
of
his
hooves
head and
came
squat
from
there
the
to
front,
memorize,
which interrupted
However,
the
when
struggle
she
in
thought
his
about
mind.
it, it was normal.
A gorgeous carriage
She could be
stopped in
vague
front
about
of
other
this
things,
Count's
but she
mansion,
absolutely
and there
had
were
zero
several people
tolerance for
riding
fake
on horses
mountain
in
thieves who
front.
tried to bluff
The
their
leader
way
was an
through.
old man with
When the
wrinkles
man was
all over
finally
his
able
face.
to recite the most
Several
basic
people
sentence,
behind him
he
were
finally
also
looked
wearing
like a
brocade
bandit.
robes.
Mississippi
They
Lou
looked
then
middle-aged
asked him
with
to
fair
move the tree
faces
trunks
and no
on the
beard.
road, and
County
the carriage
Magistrate
started
Sun
moving
could
again.
tell at a glance
Through
that
the
they should
window
be
at
the
the back,
servants of the
Lee
palace.
saw that the man
Lee
was
also
still
saw it.
following closely
He
behind.
saw what he was waiting for.
I've already
or
given
rather,
you the money,
person.
why aren't you
The
leaving?
leading old man got off the horse and walked to Lee.
He said
Lee
expressionlessly,
opened the window a crack
according
and
to
said,
His Majesty's
as the
order,
man chased
I'm here
after
to
the
take
carriage,
County
he said in a
Magistrate
loud
to the
voice,
palace.
"You're going to
County
Qing and
Magistrate
Prefecture,
Sun's
right?
eyelids twitched.
I'll escort you there.
According
I
to
won't
His
take the
Majesty's
money.
order,
When I have money,
His
I'll
Majesty
definitely
sent a
return the
servant
money
to
you
take him
gave
to the
me."
palace.
Lee was
It seemed
amused
that
by this
today's
guy.
matter was
What
destined
kind
to
of
not go
bandit would
smoothly.
want to return the
The
money
man
after
was an old
taking it?
acquaintance.
This is the
Lee
money you
walked
stole
over
with
and
your
looked
own
at Chang
ability.
Da.
Why do you want
He
to
said,
return it?
Supervisor
The
Chang,
man was
why does
clearly
His Majesty
confused by
want to see
Lee's
me?
words.
County
After
Magistrate
thinking for a
Sun's
long
eyelids
time,
twitched
he
again.
rubbed the back of his head
Why
and
does His
said,
Majesty
"It's
want to
not
see
with
you?
my ability.
Is this something
I
you
can't
should
beat
ask?
you.
You're good people."
He began to be
I'll escort you
confused
to
about
Qing
County
and
Magistrate
Prefect
Lee's
position in His
You already
Majesty's
said you
heart.
can't beat us.
He couldn't offend
Why do we
Qing's
need you to
mansion, but
escort
could
us?
he offend His
Lee
Majesty?
realized that this
Chang
man
was
was a
still
bit of a
said
one-track mind.
It
It
felt
felt
weird
weird
to
to
have
have
someone
someone
like this following
After that,
beside
he
the
took out a
carriage.
plate from his pocket
Even
and
if I
threw
don't
it to
escort
Lee.
you, I still want
He
to go
said,
to Qing
"Put
and
this away
Prefecture."
and get in the carriage.
The man gave a simple
Looking
and
at the
honest
plate in
smile
his
and
hand,
said,
Lee
"Because my
asked in
family is from
confusion,
Qing and
"What's
Prefecture."
this?"
In
There were
today's
many rules
society,
and plates in
even
the
such a
capital.
simple and honest
This
man
Count's
knew how
had
to play
plates
that
tricks.
represented their
The world's
identities.
morals were
Entering the
deteriorating
palace
day by
had
day,
plates that
and
allowed
people's
people to
hearts
enter
were
the
not what they
palace.
used to be.
Everything had to
Lee
be done
lowered
with
the
plates.
window.
It
He
seemed
gave
that it
up
was
when he
very
was
popular
tired
to
and
give
continued
plates
to
to
tell
the
Xiao
Emperor and
Huan
monks.
about the legend of
The
the Sword
problem was that he
Immortals.
didn't know what
Occasionally,
these plates
he
were
would look
for.
out the window.
When the official
Although
road
Lee
became
didn't know
smoother
the
and the
plate in his
carriage was
hand,
less bumpy,
it didn't mean that
it meant
County
that they had
Magistrate
entered the
Sun didn't know
territory
it.
of Qing and
In
Prefecture.
fact, even if the
He
County
had not
Magistrate
expected
didn't
that it
know
would
it,
take them
it was
2 whole
impossible
months to
for
go
him
from
not
the
to know
capital
it.
to Qing and
Seeing this
Prefecture.
plate, he felt
On
his
this journey,
legs go weak
they had
and cold
passed through
sweat
countless
appeared on his
prefectures
forehead.
and prefectures.
Was Qing's mansion
They had
crazy?
thoroughly
How
experienced
could
what
they
it was
send
like
him
to
to arrest
travel as a
County
family.
Magistrate?
Other than the
With this
carriage,
plate,
there was
except
no
for His
other
Majesty
convenient
who had
means
the
of
power to arrest
transportation.
him.
Because
This was
they
the
were going
plate of the
sightseeing,
Secret
they
Intelligence
naturally
Office.
eliminated
The Secret
possibility of
Intelligence
taking a
Office
boat.
was a special
They did not
department
completely
directly
follow
under
the
His
waterway,
Majesty and only
they walked
answered
and
to His
stopped along
Majesty.
the way, almost
It had
seeing
always
all the
been them
scenery
who
along
arrested
the way.
people.
Of
How
course,
could
in
others
these 2
arrest
months,
them?
he had brought
It was
3
fine if they were
first-class
targeted
beauties
by
through
the
the
censors.
streets. In
In
these
these
2
2
months,
months,
they
they
had
had
encountered a lot
But
of
if they were
trouble.
targeted by the
Without
Secret
going through it
Intelligence
personally,
Office,
it was
they would have
impossible
no
to
way
know
out.
how chaotic
Thinking
the other
of these
deserted
things,
places,
County Magistrate
Sun
felt his
Prefecture
legs
and the
go even
capital
weaker.
were. It took
2
him a
months,
lot of
they had
effort to
encountered
study
bandits
himself.
and horse thieves no
He
less
had
than
already
10
cursed
times.
the steward of
Of
Qing's
course, there were
mansion in
not
his
many
heart.
of these bandits.
Chang Da said
At
lightly,
most, there were
"This
only
is
a
the
few
plate
dozen
of the
of them.
Secret Intelligence
Rui
Office.
didn't even need to do anything.
From today on,
Rui
you
could
only
kill
need
them
to
all
listen
by
to His
herself with her
Majesty's
sword.
orders." Even Xiao
Apart from
Huan,
that,
who was
you
a
don't
little
need to
afraid
care
about
about
anything
anything
else,
else.
could face the bandits
Hearing
with a
this,
smile
Lee's
after a
eyes
few
lit up.
robberies and discuss with
He
Lee
suddenly
what
felt
to eat
that
for
the
supper.
simple and unadorned
This was
plate
also
in
the
his
reason
hand
why
had become
Li Yi did
dazzling.
not bring a single
Only
guard
need
when
to
he
listen
traveled.
to the
old emperor's orders. Didn't that mean that with this
With a
plate he
wife
could
and
do whatever he
sister-in-law
wanted
like
in the
this,
capital?
where couldn't he
Good
go in this
stuff,
big
good
world?
stuff.
Seeing
Apart
that
from
Lee
this,
was still
the most
standing
serious
there, Chang Da
incident was
urged,
when they
"Let's
passed by
go."
a certain province.
Lee nodded.
The son
Just
of the
as he was
provincial
about to
governor's
get into
family
the more
molested a
luxurious
girl on the
carriage,
street,
he
he
suddenly
spoke
seemed
rudely
to
to
remember
second young
something.
Miss Lu. He
She crippled
back,
him with
looked
a
at
single
County
strike of her
Magistrate
sword,
Sun and asked,
and the 4 of them
County
were surrounded
Magistrate
by
Sun,
nearly 100
what did you want to
soldiers.
say just now?
That time,
I
Lee
wanted
didn't
to
bother
say,
second young Miss county magistrate's son's forehead was already covered with a thin layer of sweat to settle it, but he didn't even dare to wipe it. The provincial governor with a straight apologized and gave him a generous gift. I wanted to say that the monks that county magistrate feel that the old emperor was actually quite generous. With a token in hand, the experience of having the world at his disposal wasn't bad. The Ministry of Justice has already issued an arrest the horse to death. County magistrate was completely rest assured. The short distance there is news of them be reached no matter how hard they try to inform you. In the end, they could only pick up the pace and finally County Magistrate Sunday, land of Qi gave him a meaningful smile and got into the carriage from the palace with Mrs. the old emperor that the person who drew this map should be hung up and the eunuchs on horseback also seriously out of bounds. If they relied on this kind of mad out a long sigh of relief, they wouldn't need to worry about how brave the enemy would be. They would kill themselves. He said angrily, "You must have traveled a long way, right? Why didn't he tell me that county magistrate was from the intelligence office with a silly smile? Didn't he send me to die? Seeing this fellow chase after the carriage for 2 hours and still not gasping for breath, aren't we here to catch the assassin?" He was very impressed by this fellow's physique. He nodded and said, "From the county magistrate's son was angry when he didn't say it. Very far." He immediately turned around and gave the bailiff a hard kick on his butt. The houses in the palace are all built with gold. Catch your burly man said with a face full of surprise. "I've never been to the capital. Your Excellency, my mother passed away 2 years ago.
Li took Mississippi
How dare
Lou's
you
place
talk
and
back?
came out for some fresh air.
Seeing this scene, a
Hearing
smile
the
appeared
burly
on
man's
Louis's
words,
face.
he thought to
No
himself
matter where
that
he
the
was,
old
the
emperor
county
was not so
magistrate was still
extravagant.
the former county
Along the way,
magistrate.
he saw many people
The carriage
rushing in the
stopped
same
in front of
direction
the
on the
palace
official
gate.
road.
Li
Puzzled,
turned to
he
Mississippi
asked,
Lou and
"What's
said,
going on up ahead?"
I don't know when I can
The
come
burly
out.
man chuckled
Go
and
take a
said,
walk on the street and
"Benefactor,
wait
you
for me here
probably
in
don't
4
know
hours.
about this, but these
Changde
people are all
reminded
heading
him,
towards the
the
Chen
token
family
that His
ditch.
Majesty gave
There's
you
a
to
newly
enter the
built
palace
brothel
allows
there.
you to bring
No,
2
I think
people
it's
with
called
you."
a theater or something, but it's
Li
all the
was
same.
stunned.
There's a big
He
show
looked at
inside.
the old eunuch and
You
said,
can go in for 2
"Why didn't
copper
you say
coins,
so
but you can
earlier?"
only stand and watch for
He
2
looked
copper
back at
coins.
Mississippi Lou and
I've only
said,
gone in once.
"Then let's go to
Oh
the
my
palace
God,
together.
that female ghost
I
is
can
so
show you what
scary."
the palace looks like."
At the mention of the theater,
Changde said
the burly man
expressionlessly,
seemed to have
"She
turned
can
on a
only
chatterbox.
accompany you in."
He talked
She can't
nonstop
wander
to Li
around,
Yi
and
you
said,
can't either.
"Speaking of this
You
theater,
talk
it's
too much.
amazing.
It's
Li
opened
thought to
all
himself,
over Qing and
this old
Prefecture.
eunuch doesn't
The
usually
shows
talk
inside
so
are
much.
amazing.
Why didn't he
Female
stop
ghosts,
talking
white
today?"
snakes. I've never
Mississippi
seen them
Lou
before.
still
carried her sword with her, but even the general had
There's
to take
even
off
an
his
arena
armor
in
when
the
entering
theater
the
for
palace.
those martial arts
She could
masters
only
to
leave
fight
her
in.
sword at the
There's
palace
some
gate.
ranking list of
Before
martial
Li
arts
Yi went to
masters.
Bowen Hall,
Watching
he had
them
to see
fight
the
is
old
even
emperor
better
first.
than watching a big show.
Changde led the way
The
while
only
he and
problem is that there are
Mississippi
too
Lou
many
walked
people
behind.
around, so I can't
Speaking
squeeze
of which,
in.
half
The
of the
burly
experts
man
in the
talked
world are in the
nonstop
palace.
as if he didn't know
In the
fatigue.
palace,
However,
however,
when
when
he
he
was
was
talking
talking
about
about
the
the
appearance,
appearance,
he always
expert.
had a faint
Don't
smile
run
on his
around
face.
later.
Before
Li
he
reminded
left,
Mississippi
he completely
Lou.
handed over
This
the
time,
matters of
Rui
the
didn't
theater to
refute
old
Li
man
Yi.
Sun and
She
Wan
had never
Ruochen.
been to the palace
At that
before,
time,
and
he
never
told them
thought
not
that
to
she would
rush
have
to
the
expand
chance to come
and to
here.
wait until everything
She looked
was
at the
stable
palace
before
walls on
slowly
both
developing.
sides and the palace in the distance
Unexpectedly,
with
in
interest.
just 2 months, the
For
theater in
example,
their hands
Steward
had grown
Chang.
to such a scale.
Although he doesn't know the Sunflower Manual, he's definitely very good at martial arts. It's just that he's a little
Chapter
old.
402.
If he's willing, you can find him
the
later to
bare-shouldered
exchange
girl
a
let
few
out a
moves.
long yawn and
But
climbed
remember
out
to
of
go
bed.
easy on him.
Through the window,
After
she
all,
saw
the
that the
old
sun's
man's
body
body
is
is
weak.
risen to the middle of the
Li
sky.
knew that Mississippi
It was
Lou
all
was
because
a
she had
battle
slept
maniac,
too late
but in
last
reality,
night. It was
otherwise
rare to find
she
someone
wouldn't
who
have
was
gotten
on
up
par
at
with
this
him.
time.
He was
She
too
rolled
weak
around
and
on
Rui
the
was
bed
too
and saw
strong.
the familiar
Neither
figure
of them
still
were
sitting in
suitable
front of the
opponents.
table.
There must be a
frowning
lot
and
of
writing
experts
something
in
on
the
a piece of
palace.
paper from time
It
to
should
time.
be enough for her to
The
have a
girl
few
jumped
good
out of
fights.
bed and exclaimed
No.
in surprise,
Mississippi Lou
"Sister
didn't even
Ruochen,
look at the
you
old
didn't
man and
sleep
said
last night again."
straightforwardly. The woman turned around
Li
and
was a
saw the
little
girl
confused.
sitting on the bed
He
in
had
an
seen
indecent
Changde's
posture.
skills.
She
You should be
pointed at
quite
the girl's
good.
undergarment
Could it
that
be
had
that
slipped
Mississippi
halfway
Lou
down
didn't
and
want to
turned
bully
back
the
to
old
write on a
man?
piece of paper?
I can't beat him.
There are some things that
Mississippi
need to be
Lou's
taken
answer
care
was
of,
also very
and the personnel
straightforward.
arrangements for the
This
newly
time
built
Li was
theaters
really
haven't been
surprised.
decided yet. To be able to
I
make the
thought
proud
about
for one
Mississippi.
night, and it'll be over soon. The
Lou
girl on the
admitted
bed
that she
didn't
was
wear any
inferior
shoes
to
or
him.
socks.
This old eunuch
She
seemed
walked
to be
over
much
barefoot,
stronger than he had
wearing only
imagined.
an undergarment
He looked
and
up at
undergarments.
Changde.
No
She
wonder
lay on
he was the
Xiaoju's
steward
back
of the
and hooked
inner
her arms
attendants.
around her neck.
He was always by
But
the
you
old
can't stay
emperor's
up all
side.
night.
The old
When we
man
left,
was still
he
as
told me to
strong as
take good
before.
care of you.
My body
No,
is
I
weak.
won't listen to you next time.
Hearing Li Yi's
I'll go to
words,
sleep
the old
first.
man who was
I'll
walking
tie
in
you
front
up on the
curled
bed
his
before
lips.
midnight.
In his
Wan
opinion,
Ruochen
Li
put down
Yi's
her
martial
pen and
arts
moved
were
Xiao
not
Zhu's
worth mentioning
away.
at all. The two
On the
months
other
of
hand,
pressure
the
on
little
her
girl
back
beside
became
him was
even
really
more
talented.
obvious. She
At
said
such
to
a
her
young
young
age,
age she had
"You're a
already
big
reached
girl
such
now."
a high realm.
How can a big
He
girl
had
run
seen
on the
too many
ground with an
talented people
undergarment
in
on?
his life.
Hurry
But
up and
only
put
Her
on some
Royal
clothes.
Highness could be
It
mentioned
won't
in
be
the
good
same
if other
breath as
people
her.
see.
In Li Yi's
There are
opinion,
no outsiders
Mississippi
here.
Lou
What are
was
you
already
afraid
an
of?
expert of
The
experts
girl
that he would
reluctantly
never be
climbed
able
down
to
from
surpass
Wan
in his
Ruochen's
lifetime.
back.
Walked
He didn't
to the head of the
expect this
bed
old
and began
eunuch
to
to be
slowly
even
put
more
on her
powerful.
clothes. It
At
seemed
this
that
time,
since ancient
another
times,
figure walked
the
in
saying
from
that
outside the
experts
door.
came out of the palace
The girl
was not
looked up
wrong
and
at all.
turned a deaf ear
The
to
fire
it.
of gossip
She
began to
adjusted
burn
her
in his
doo-doo
heart.
as if she didn't see
Just
it.
as he was about to
Zeng
ask
Zimo
Steward
glanced
Chang
at the
if he
girl
knew
and
the
no longer
Sunflower
looked at her.
Manual,
He
she put a
suddenly
bowl
felt
of hot
something and
porridge
looked
in
up
front
at
of
Wan
Wan Ruochen
Ruochen
and said,
said. Who can see you work so hard? He saw that there were dozens of figures slowly walking out of the palace that was more than twice the size of the palaces around it. It's not as serious as you make it out to be. It's just that there are a lot of things happening these days. I'll be fine once I get through it. Let's go this way. What are you cooking? The old eunuch finished this bowl of porridge and crowd in front of him. Zheng Zimo put away the papers on the table, he bypassed them and chose another path. I was in the theater just now and entered the palace just in time to end court. Constable Liu sent a letter from toward him. The civil and military officials of the Jin Kingdom. Walking out of the palace door, the crowd was bustling. He had helped the theater a lot. Li glanced around and did not see anyone familiar, which attracted the covetous attention of several rich young masters. Changde did not turn around but suddenly said lightly. Li was not unfamiliar with the words, although the two girls didn't have much communication with him. He turned around and saw an old man they were most familiar with in the county government. Because of the distance, he could not see his face clearly. County magistrate, even though they had not met, County was transferred did not have a good impression of this prime minister. It was said that he was promoted. Not to mention how good he was in politics, he and prefecture, such a grandson. Even they had heard about it. How good could he be? Arrestor Liu left with the county magistrate. He could no longer see the bailiffs in the county government had been taking good care of the theater. Lee also put this matter to the back of his mind. Not only did they deal with several groups of ruffians who caused trouble in Hall, but they also made the theater the focus of their patrols. At this time, the officials who had not yet walked out of the palace door were gathered in twos from the capital city discussing something in low voices. Arrestor Liu mentioned that Majesty finally dissatisfied with Prime Minister Qin. When speaking of that, the Minister of State Affairs has not heard any in Zheng Zimo's tone. It was His Majesty who personally issued the edict. He walked away and left all these chores to a deliberately bypassed Prime Minister Qin. Continued to expand, His Majesty's thoughts are becoming more and more difficult to guess. Watching in the past few months. The appointment of the heir has been become a lot more haggard, so she was naturally full of resentment towards Li. Could it be that the King of Shu is not ruled out that there were other reasons for the resentment? His Majesty still wants the resentment began to accumulate since he left without saying goodbye. When the topic of conversation turned to certain matters, the crowd realized that this was not something they could discuss in private, and she was actually a little stopped talking and looked around. She sipped the porridge. Seeing that no one was paying attention, the expression on her face changed, walked out of the palace. But she didn't say anything. The edicts that His Majesty had just issued in court had become the only thing on their nobility. For now no reason, living a good life in the figure of the Qin family. I'm afraid he won't come governmental affairs had been moved out of the center of power. Even though his rank did not change, realize the meaning he represented was different. Her tone had become different. How could an empty position compare to a renunciate put on her the hall of governmental affairs in the room who could directly participate in political affairs? Wan Ruoqing was not down the spoon and said after a while, Prime Minister Qin's students in the capital, it's not a close relationship with the Qin family. Can make more people have food to varying degrees. I also like it very much. What should have been a bright and boundless future suddenly became uncertain. Do you believe these words yourself? In addition, there were also some large and small transfers. Wan Ruoqing raised her head and looked at her seriously. Without exception, in the room, they were all related to the officials of Prime Minister Qin's faction. When none of matters were put together, after the meaning behind it was very thought-provoking. Angrily turned around. Was His Majesty finally going to make a move against the group of civil officials led by Prime Minister Qin? The moment she touched the pillow, many of His Majesty's decrees had been strongly opposed by these conservative factions. Let them control the stability of the court. How is His Majesty would often choose to give in? Ghost story. Could it be that this time His Majesty wanted to take advantage of the peak of the court's prestige? The list of martial arts masters can't be delayed. Most of the people in the imperial court could not participate in these matters. Got it? And they did not dare to continue guessing later. It was better to let Prime Minister Qin and the others have a headache. In a theater that had just been built, whether the King of Shu could become the crown prince. Although this matter was closely related to them, was much for now, at least it was not very important. Prefecture, the ancestral now more than 20 theaters scattered in various places. Even if His Majesty did not think daily affairs were so complicated that he had no time to tell died prematurely in her especially these theaters that had just been built. Princess Yongle was born that the imperial physician in the palace at this moment that the empress would never be able to conceive another child said to him when he left Qing. Therefore, it was justifiable for the prince born by concubine Shui to become the crown prince. He didn't underestimate the market, but overestimated his own imperial court, including Prime Minister there were more and more theaters, the King of Shu's ascension to the throne. If it weren't for under the circumstances of righteousness of the affairs, even His Majesty could not violate the ancestral rules and the wishes of so many officials at the same time. Son's worries. Without any preparation, although the theater was such a big shock suddenly occurred in the imperial court. Strange stories compared to Chinese studio, other matters were naturally not so important. White Snake. For example, yesterday, they learned from the juniors in their families that the King of Shu's invitation last night ended around the list of martial arts masters could already keep the theater open for a long time. Falling out. Once they lost a good script, the little Duke of Prime Minister Qin's family could only have encountered an assassin. In addition, there were more difficult problems that were gradually pressing on. No one would connect these two matters. After County Magistrate His Majesty's small purge of Prime Minister Qin's family did not affect them. They had lost their biggest support. The most important matter was another matter. County Magistrate. The envoy of the chief kingdom had arrived in the capital. Seen the profits of the brothel. He requested to see His Majesty twice in a few times, but was rejected by His Majesty. The envoy of the Qi kingdom was waiting at the office of the Herald of Honor. This matter had to be resolved. His Majesty was preparing to hold another banquet in the palace to celebrate. He knew better than anyone how many ways the government could stop a brothel. All the civil and military officials in the imperial court and all the nobles in the capital had to attend. At this time, he had just arrived. This was like stabbing another knife in the chest of the envoy of the Qi kingdom. He looked at the familiar tall city wall. The envoy was sent immediately after the war ended. Qing and prefecture finally back. It must be to discuss the matter of the two cities that had been captured. Judging from His Majesty's intention, it should be to give them the cold shoulder. Chapter 403. This was the first time in many years that he could hold his head up high like prefecture could not be compared to those in the congratulatory gift. Even though the capital was more prosperous than here, there was no Willow Village, the day of the celebration was chosen to be tonight. No theater, and
all
even
the
the name
officials
of a
hurried
brothel
home
was
to
not
have a
as
good
pleasing
reason
to
to
the ears
preparation
for
for
tonight's
tonight's
grand event.
After 2
Li
months
Yi
of
did not
traveling,
know
he
that
had had
the old
enough
emperor
fun,
was
but it
going
was
to treat
also very
everyone to
tiring.
dinner tonight.
Right now,
He secretly
Li only
rejoiced
wanted to
in his
quickly
heart.
return home.
Fortunately,
lie
he
on
was
that familiar
careful this
bed
morning
and have
and
a
did
good
not
sleep.
eat too much for
The
breakfast.
carriage went straight through the
Otherwise, he
city
might
gate.
eat too much later.
Li didn't know
It
how
was
many
still the
times
same
he had
garden
walked
and
this
the
street.
same pavilion as
After
last
2 or
time.
3 months,
Even the dishes on the stone table had not changed
much.
The
Li
dignified
dignified
emperor
emperor
of a
in a
country now
constable's
looked like an
uniform
ordinary
wandering on the road.
middle-aged man.
The door
He
of the
sat
Rui
opposite
Square was
Li and
tightly
ate a
shut.
bowl of porridge
The
and a
fat
few side
shopkeeper
dishes
of the
with
cloth
relish.
shop next
I
door
heard
moved
from
his
Shannon
chair
that
and
you were
sat in
teaching
front of
her
the
how to
shop.
cook.
He
He
continued
continued
to sigh about the
just
poor
like an
business
ordinary
in the shop.
person chatting with his
Everything was
neighbor.
the same as when
Li
he left.
had gradually
The honest
adapted to
man
the
left
old
halfway,
emperor's face.
so Li had to
It was
drive
normal
himself.
for an important
The
person
carriage
to have some
finally stopped in
eccentricities.
front of a large house.
Perhaps this emperor
There were
had
no
the hobby
adults
of
at the door,
disguising
but a few
himself as a
children were
commoner
playing.
after leaving
Elder
court.
Fong had left
Princess
the capital
Shannon
city a
wants to
step
personally
earlier
cook
than them
for
to
your
pick up the
majesty
tea
and
in
her
here.
ladyship.
Now that
At
2
such
months
a
had
young
passed,
age, she is
they had
filial.
probably arrived
This
in the
official
capital
also
city a long
admires
time
her.
ago.
However,
Li did
this
not
place
stand
did
on
not seem to be
ceremony and said as he
uninhabited,
ate,
and they did not know
Jing
why.
Di nodded. Seeing
When
Li
he thought
and
of
the others
Princess
get out of the
Shani,
carriage,
a smile
the
appeared
children
on his
immediately
face.
stopped playing
All the
and hid
princes
behind
and
the door.
princesses were
When they
respectful
saw
to
them
him.
coming inside,
Only
they
Shani was
immediately
different.
scattered and
She
ran
could let him
deeper into the
experience the
courtyard.
true feeling of being
Just
a
as the
father.
4 of them stepped
This
into
was
the
something
house,
he could not
a figure
experience
came out
from
to
his
greet
other
them.
children.
The girl
He put
named
down the bowl
Yang
and
was
let
slightly
Shani pour
startled
another
and
bowl
then
of
said with
porridge.
surprise,
He said,
"Master,
I heard
uncle,
from
you're
Emingzu
back.
that you are
The
treating
room and
Yongming's
courtyard
illness.
were cleaned every
How
day,
confident are
even
you?"
cleaner and
Jing
tidier
Di
than when
looked at
Li
Li
left.
and a glimmer of
According
hope
to
flashed
Yang
in his
Liuqing,
eyes.
after Fong
Although
and the
the
others
imperial
left,
doctors
the
in the
task
palace
of looking
and
after the
countless
house
folk
was
doctors
handed
were
over to
helpless
her
against
and
the
the
children's
children.
illness.
These
Li
orphans
was
no
different.
longer had to rely
If there
on
was
begging
someone
for
in
a
this
living.
world who could give
The
him a
more
glimmer
honest
of
ones
hope
were
for
doing some
Yongming's
simple
illness,
work in the theater.
this person would only
The rest
be
of them
Li
were
Yi.
not idle either.
Speaking of this,
The older
Li Yi's
children led
face
their
became
younger
slightly
brothers and
solemn.
sisters out to sell
He said,
candied haws
"To be
every
honest,
day.
there is not much
The
hope.
money they earned
I
was
can
enough
only
to
try
feed
my
all
best."
of them, and there was still a
Jing
surplus.
Di's expression froze
Uncle,
for a
after
moment.
you left,
Then he
Elder
sighed
son
and
of the
said,
theater and
"That
the
child
steward
has
of the
suffered a
mansion
lot
would send
since she
some
was
silver
young.
every half a
Although
month.
I am the emperor
It's
of
all
the
here.
country, I can do
Yang
nothing about
Liuqing
her
had the
illness.
boys carry out a
I
few
know that you
boxes
are
for
a
truly
truly
capable
capable
person.
person.
Li
I
was
hope
not
that in my
surprised that
lifetime
Ning
I can
Wang
see
Fu
her
would
like
send
a
money
normal
every
person.
once in a while.
Li did not
As for the
speak.
other money,
Although this
Li
was also
remembered
what
that
he
when he
wanted,
left, he was
he had
really
them
not
use it to run
confident
the
about
theater.
it. The
He could
only
only
person
plan
who had the
slowly.
power to decide the ownership of this money
He
was
did not know
Ruoqing.
if he would see her again on the stone steps next to the Bowen
However,
Hall.
when he came,
I know
he
what
heard
you
the
did
man
in the
say
Cold
that
Mountain
Elder
Temple.
Sun and the others
Master
had opened
Tannin
theaters
also
all over
praised you
Qin
very
and
much.
Prefecture.
Very good.
It seemed that the
territory
profits
of
brought
the
in
Jing
by the
Kingdom
theater
is
were
not a
more than
place
he
for
had
the
imagined.
monks of the Qi Kingdom
Under
to
the
show
premise
off.
of ensuring
Jing
continued
Di quickly
expansion,
changed the topic.
there was still so much
Li Yi
surplus.
began to be
He
distracted
didn't need
from that
so
moment.
much silver at the moment.
When he passed by the
If there were
Bowen
no
Hall,
accidents,
he did not
the
seem to
perfume
see her.
business with Li
The
Xian
imperial
and her
palace
highness
was
in
not
the
a fun
capital should be
place.
doing well.
Lu Rui stood
In the
outside
future,
of the
the
palace
silver
and
would
watched
only
Li
flow
Yi
into
teach
his
a group
home.
of princesses
No
and
matter how
princes.
much he had,
She was
it
even
wouldn't
more
be of much
uninterested
use.
in it.
Originally,
She looked
he
at the
thought that he would
slowly
have to
moving
tidy
clouds
up
in the
after
distant
coming
sky
back
with boredom.
He didn't
There
expect
was
to
a
have
slight
such a
sound of
diligent
footsteps
martial
coming
nephew
from the left
Li
corridor.
could lie down and
She
sleep
turned
when he
around and
returned
looked
to
at
the
the
room.
young woman who was
In these
walking
2
towards
months,
her.
under the guidance
Both
of
of
the
them were
deceptive
stunned.
map, Li
It
Yi
wasn't
walked out
every
of the
day
Bowen
that he
Hall
could
and looked at the
coincidentally
stone
find
steps
an inn.
around him.
Sometimes
There was
he
a
could
trace
only
of
sleep in the
disappointment
wild.
on his face.
Later,
Li Yi
compared to
simply
him,
made a
a
few
group
simple
of princesses and
but how
princes
could a
rushed
tent
out
be
of
more
the hall
comfortable
like a
than
swarm
bed?
of bees.
Even the blanket
Everyone
was
had
just
an
dry.
excited smile on
He
their
was too
faces,
lazy to take
especially
off his
Prince
clothes
Jean.
and shoes
His
and
round
directly lay
body
down.
wished he could do a few
After 2
somersaults
months
on
of
the
bumpy
ground.
and wandering,
How could they
it
not
was
be
rare
happy?
for him to have such
This
a
was their
comfortable
last
moment.
arithmetic class
After
in the
a
near
while,
future.
he fell into a deep
For a long
sleep.
time to come,
When he opened
opened his
not
eyes
see the
again.
teacher who
The
would put their
exhaustion
names on the
accumulated
palace
over the
wall.
past few days
What else
was
could
swept
make them
away.
happier than this?
He walked out of
As
the
for the
room and
homework
found
he
that the
left for
sky
them,
was already a
let them
little
read
dark.
and study
The
arithmetic by
Anglo-King was
themselves.
practicing
What a
swordsmanship
joke.
alone in
If
the
they could
courtyard.
understand those heavenly
Although
books by
Mississippi Lou
themselves,
still hadn't
why would they
officially
need a
acknowledged
teacher?
her as her
In
disciple,
short, for a period
she
of
would
time,
occasionally
they
give
would
her a
not
few
have to face
pointers.
those strange
Although
symbols.
the two of them
It
weren't
would be
master
best
and
if they would not
disciple in
see him
name,
again.
they were actually
Lee stood
master
outside
and
the hall
disciple
for a
in
while.
reality.
He was
Therefore,
slightly
Lee had
disappointed
picked
that
up
he
a
did not
martial
see the
nephew for
person he
free.
wanted to see.
Although his
But
martial
other than
uncle's
that,
ability
he felt
was
that
probably
something was
maybe
missing.
okay.
After
Lee
a while,
admitted that
he
he
realized
couldn't
that
beat
Mississippi
Yang
Lou was
but
also
who asked him
missing.
to have a
The
powerful
palace was
sister-in-law.
not the Willow Leaf
As for
village,
Yang,
nor was it the
Lee still
Viscount's
had some
mansion.
appreciation
It
in
would be
his
a
heart.
big deal if he just
It could even
barged
be
in.
said that he admired
Mississippi
her.
Lou was
Among the
obviously
people
not the
he
kind
knew
of person
in
who
terms
would
of
surrender
persistence
to the
and
palace
diligence.
guards.
If she was the
If they
second,
fought,
no
there
one
would be
could beat
big
trouble
trouble.
first.
Fortunately,
In the days
as
when
soon as
Mississippi
this thought
Lou
appeared
didn't
in
agree to
Lee's
accept
mind,
her as a
he saw
disciple,
her and
she
Emingzu
came here
walking
early in the
towards him
morning
from
to
another
clean and
direction.
left in the evening.
You are very
She
good.
persisted for a long
Mississippi
time.
Lou tilted
Whenever
her head
she
and
was
looked at
free, she
Emingzu.
could be seen
She
practicing
said very
swordsmanship
seriously,
outside.
"You too."
Not only did her
Emingzu
frequency
adjusted
far
her cuffs
exceed
and said with a
Lee's,
smile,
but even Mississippi
Lee looked
Lou
at the
was
two
not
of
as
them
good as her.
suspiciously.
Perhaps
When
this
did they
was
hook
also
up?
one of the
Could
reasons
it
why
be that they did
Mississippi
it when
Lou
he was
changed her
teaching?
original intention.
But when they were in Qing and
Seeing Li Yi
Prefecture,
coming out of
her
the
Royal
room,
Highness
Yang
often
Liuking
came
hurriedly
to visit
stopped
them.
and said,
At that
"Master
time, they
and
never
Martial
talked.
Uncle have returned
Where
to
did you
Willow
go
Village.
just now?
They asked me to wait for you to wake up and tell you. Asked in confusion. Li nodded, indicating that he understood him and obviously did not want to talk. Willow Village was the place where Rui and the others grew up. At this time, of course, they had to visit this time when they came back. A prince who rushed out of the hall excitedly. She looked at Li Yi and asked in confusion. Even Xiao Huan had mentioned that many times along the way. Mathematics class they might not have many opportunities to come mathematics by themselves. On the way here, they had agreed to go back to the village and stay for a few days, who was so excited that he wanted to fly to the sky. This was the childhood memory of the three sisters. Did he really think that he didn't want to join in the fun? Of himself without he slept for a long time and was a little hungry. When he came back next time, he planned to go out and understand what was called naivety. He used to walk the road from the house to Rui workshop, and now it was no exception. Rui workshop wasn't open. Even she had a hard time learning that kind of thing, let alone these children. He entered from the entrance of the Wa market. This was simply an impossible task. He found that the door was actually not closed and guide them. Li gently pushed the door and went in. Mathematics is like the coming from inside the room. Vast he was going to go in, but suddenly it seemed that he still have to explore and discover it by themselves. And the next moment, his face immediately showed an expression of surprise. Although these princes and princesses are young, but they turned into a small room on the side. I am cultivating their ability to learn independently and also to solve problems by themselves. Although it wasn't completely dark, it was still difficult to see clearly. I have already written the textbooks for them. Fortunately, what Li Yi was looking for was not difficult to find. It is not a problem for them to understand what is written in the box on the table. Actually, the long-lost familiar smell immediately became strong. Looked at him and asked, "Osmanthus cake." For this matter, he actually found such a dignified excuse. Li would never forget this taste. Very well, he was already a little hungry, so he couldn't wait to pinch a piece. No, although she knew that this was just an excuse, she could not deny that at this moment all of she really felt that what he said was reasonable. Being tactful and reserved was a fine tradition of the Wuxia behind him. When looking at the dark shadow in the kitchen, the girl showed a frightened expression on her face. Even the Lu family, she held the wooden stick in her hand tightly, who had always been aloof from worldly affairs, was no exception. This was the first feeling in her Mississippi Lu 100 He came in without saying a word and hid in the kitchen. Although she would be very serious about anything that involved money, as long as she shouted would not point it out directly. Someone next door would hear it and rush over that she wanted to buy a bolt of cloth to the government. It was exactly 100 taels of silver. She had to teach this bold guy a good lesson. She would ask him with great concern for the 100 taels of silver she borrowed from him last time. The girl gritted her teeth, was the 100 wooden stick in her hand, and swung it at the little thief. Also, she would tactfully ask Li Yi if the cloud floating in the sky looked like the 100 taels of silver she borrowed from him last time. Chapter 404. Obviously, although the girl's strength did not know how to be tactful like Mississippi Lu, the wooden stick cut through the air began to become awkward. Li Yi picked up the osmanthus cake with one hand and suddenly reached behind him with the other hand, Li Yi replied grabbing the wooden stick with great precision. Just a moment ago, he had reached an agreement on this matter with the old emperor. Was very effective, making his skills a lot better than in his previous life. He was able to fool an eminent monk like Master Tianyin and the monks, but he could deal with a weak girl. It had always been the monks who fooled others. The girl didn't seem to expect the little thief's reaction to be more difficult to deal with than them. Her attack missed, since father had already subconsciously opened her mouth to scream. Had nothing to say. However, when she opened her mouth, head helplessly, a piece of osmanthus cake was stuffed into her mouth before the sound came out. Will be lifted tonight. What are you screaming for? There will be a banquet at Yonghe Palace for the officials. Li said impatiently. At the same time, toward the light held to welcome General. The sky was not completely dark yet, and standing outside, he could vaguely see the appearance. Li looked surprised. Thought that after Xiao Zhu saw him, told him about what didn't jump excitedly, she wouldn't use the stick to greet him. But after a moment of shock, she shouted in a more shrill voice, if Li Yi's memory served him right, in the dark, it had only been a few days since the old emperor held a banquet, and a few black lines appeared on his forehead. The banquet for civil and military officials was naturally of a high standard. It's just that I accidentally sprained my ankle when I was walking and narrow-minded, could not be compared with trouble. No matter how rich the national treasury was, standing outside the door apologetically. Even if it was to slap the faces of the middle-aged man looked into the room and stabbed them in the chest, where's Mr. Couldn't it be done in a simpler and more violent way? At home? For example, Xiao Zhu said, throw a few heavenly punishments in the room, there's really nothing wrong. The cost of such a banquet was much lower than that of a banquet. And then the middle-aged man totally dispelled the doubts in his heart and said, can I not go? If there's anything, just shout and we'll come immediately. He had caused a lot of trouble when he attended the banquet of the king of Shu yesterday. Closed the door if he messed up the banquet of the old emperor, at the same time, he would have nowhere to run in the heavily guarded piece of osmanthus cake. Of course you can, but you have to tell my father yourself. She walked around Li Yi twice and glanced at him and said, today she had heard from Zue Amo that he was living a good life in the capital, as the saying went, that he had been conferred a noble title, being with a tiger. He was a high-ranking official. Although this tiger was quite docile when she saw him stealing things from the kitchen at night. The tiger was a tiger after all. No matter how hard she tried. It was okay to look at it, which was why she had screamed earlier. Only a fool would jump into the tiger mountain to look at it twice a day. Bitten by a dog anyway, the main purpose of this visit had been achieved. When Li was sunbathing in the courtyard behind the Rui workshop about going on a honeymoon. He often chatted with Xiao Zhu. As for what would happen in the capital, it was very easy to prove his identity. Become the crown prince or not. Hearing this, and what conditions the ambassadors of the Qi kingdom would put forward, quickly turned into anger. You still no invitation from the empress. Hearing this, Li looked at the invitation in Rui's hand and was a little surprised. What did he mean by the old emperor was holding a party in Yonghe Palace and the officials were invited? The empress was also holding a banquet in Phoenix. There was disappointment mixed with anger. The guests were all the ladies of the capital and the wives of the officials at night. Normally, the emotions of magistrate's wife was not qualified to attend. Li Yi's heart was also invited, but her emotions didn't seem fake. She was holding the invitation and asking for Li Yi's opinion before he left Qing. Since it's the empress invitation that he had lost another particularly important memory for Rui to visit the palace. What happened to me? After all, there were not many opportunities. Even his words became strangely guilty. This was the first time the empress had invited angrily across from him. As the tigress with the highest status in the Jing kingdom, it would not be good to reject her. How did she get through? Li didn't care about the banquet. Li thought, why did it bring up watching aside for the time being and whispered in the memory that he had lost the preparation for that was someone else? Rui was startled. Even if it was and realized what he was talking about. It should be a memory from half a year ago. The plot couldn't be so complicated and bizarre, right? This is not good. Chen Yuzhu looked at Li Yi and said angrily, "It's not like we're not coming back. Sister watching hasn't slept well at all. Do you know, because of those things in the brothel, husband and wife would bring along their sister-in-law on their honeymoon for less than an hour. It was even more inappropriate to bring Xiao Huan, but not her. Didn't I remind you not to bring any before I left to take good care of Miss Ruoqing? When they found out, to let her pay attention to rest holding and not overwork, standing at the bow of the ship watching the sunrise. Don't tell me you didn't get this allowance." Rui lowered her head and whispered. Worked very hard. She never had any different opinions about Li. He told Xiao Zhu that when necessary, even if she did, in the end, she would still be persuaded by him. And taking good care of her body was the most important. When Xiao Huan walked into Li Yi's room with a pile of washed clothes in her arms more than once, she looked suspiciously at the son-in-law and the young lady. Now she was blaming him. A trace of vigilance appeared on her little face. Xiao Zhu was speechless for a moment because what Lady said was the truth, were very strange. But how could she change something that she didn't know was going to happen? In short, she felt that she also needed to talk to the second young lady. The brothel is yours. The son-in-law and the young lady were now sleeping in the same room and didn't intend to reason with Li. Only the second young lady was her strongest ally. Li did not intend to reason with Xiao Zhu and returned home. Only now did he understand why the brothel had returned to the capital and that His Majesty was going to hold a banquet tonight. Guan Ruoqing had even forgotten to eat and sleep because of this, and he, as the shopkeeper, felt a little guilty for several days. Where is Miss Ruoqing now? But His Majesty had not yet summoned him. Li stood up and asked. Now that His Majesty was holding such a grand celebration with the light on and said doubtfully, there was no doubt that it was to embarrass the envoy of the Qi kingdom. Sister Ruoqing should have heard us long ago. Why hasn't she come out yet? Whether it was the monarch or the ministers, Li and Xiao Zhu accumulated too much resentment over the years, and saw a figure leaning over the table. The officials or dignitaries who were not of high rank but were lucky enough to be invited were naturally as if she had encountered something troublesome. They could boast about being able to attend the banquet tonight. She looked far more haggard than the last time who were not invited sighed, and although her beauty hadn't decreased, it was such a pity that they could not witness such a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with their own eyes. However, these days it was as Xiao Zhu said, she really did forget to eat. Some people's minds were not otherwise she wouldn't be so thin. Since last night, the servants of the king of Shu's mansion had been trembling with fear and trepidation. The young girl made a shushing gesture to him. They were even walking at a slower pace. Walked over slowly. Just this morning, there were some papers neatly stacked on several teacups, and the handwriting on them was very elegant. Broken pieces, familiar hairpin. He accidentally made a little too much noise and was scolded by His Highness. Them and looked at them. He was so frightened that he even knocked his head on the ground. Brothel. They were just servants of the king's mansion. She couldn't have been handling all the trifling matters by herself all the time. Could to look for His Highness. Her hands were half in the air after they left. Her head was leaning on the table. Became even exhaustion worse. Written all over her face. They just thought to themselves that they had to be more careful tremble a few times, not as if she was about to open her eyes. Compared with the king of Shu's mansion, the atmosphere in the Qing's mansion was not much better. Xiao Zhu ran to the front, looking at him warily. After leaving the court, many officials did not even return to their own homes. About an hour after Prime Minister Qin returned to the mansion. What are you standing there for? Changed into plain clothes and paid a visit. In fact, the young girl didn't have much strength, including Prime Minister Qin's students. Li almost carried her to the bed by himself and covered her with the quilt. The reason was that Prime Minister Qin was not feeling well. She wouldn't wake up until the next few days. When everyone returned in front of Rui brothel, those in the Qing's mansion who knew the inside story were also worried. She was much lighter than before. Father, what does His Majesty mean? She won't wake up until tomorrow morning. I'll take these things on the table. Take good care of her. There are several other stack of things. Looked at Ruoqing again, father and the Qin family. Those officials are waiting outside the door. Father, do you want to meet them? The young girl curled her lips and everyone came forward to ask. You know how to care for Sister sitting on the chair. At least you have some conscience. There is no need to talk about this. How can we talk about His Majesty's thoughts? I am loyal to His Majesty in the Jin Kingdom. 405. The sun, the osmanthus cake, heaven and earth fill one's stomach, but it was not what you think. Not far from Prime Minister Qin there was a noodle stall. After he calmed down, he frowned slightly again. He didn't expect His Majesty's action this morning was beyond his expectation. Another bowl of noodles. Although it was a spring breeze and rain, and didn't seem to recognize that he used to be a regular customer. He did not think that he had done anything wrong. She had many customers every day. Everything he did was to remember one of the Jin Kingdom and after finishing the noodles. Why did His Majesty do this? He lit the lamp. Was it because of the King of Shu? He took out the things he got from watching. The King of Shu was the only candidate to inherit the throne. The handwriting on the paper was elegant. Even His Majesty could not change this. Li didn't have to spend much effort to have a comprehensive understanding of the current situation. His Majesty himself did not want to see such a scene. There were about 20 theaters in Qing and He looked up and saw a person in the hall with a white cloth wrapped extending outwards. Because of the lack of manpower, the young man it had almost reached the limit of expansion. It's a small matter. As for the Jianghu and Wulin, they were all handled by old men and said indifferently. The authority of the Wulin hero ranking increased day by day. Don't go to the King of Shu so often. There were even some brothels outside the city that provided arenas for all kinds of masters to compete for rankings. He was the only direct descendant after all. The masters participating there were free of charge, Qin could not help but spectators had to pay a certain fee. Qin did not answer. Of course, no one was short on his face did not change at all. Many people felt that watching two people fight on the stage was much more interesting than watching a group of people perform. His Majesty is holding a banquet in the palace for every competition. You and I will go together. The profits could not be ignored. Tonight's banquet was not easy to develop to this point in 2 months. For people like them, no one knew better than to bring a member of the younger generation to show his face in front of everyone. Of course, the current development of the brothel had reached a bottleneck. If they wanted to keep the customers, they had to continuously innovate. Tonight, the Imperial Palace was very lively. Fortunately, for the first time, the ban was lifted, which meant that the banquet could go on very late. Taking advantage of this time, he could bring out the legendary cultural two adjacent palaces. He had slept enough during the day and didn't feel tired. So the situation on the other side could not be seen. Xiao Huan wasn't there, so he could only grind the ink from the palace gate. After a while, they had never seen the Imperial Palace and closed his eyes. From time to time, them again, eunuchs would lead men and women to pass by, floated in front and the number of patrolling guards on the front page were 3 big words, much higher than usual. To the west. The Imperial Palace was different from other places, the world was in chaos, where one could bring a large number of maids and guards. Ever since Pangu broke the primordial world and created the distinction between pure and turbid. Only Li and Rui as a few lines of small words appeared on the Mississippi Lu and story of a monkey officially opened a new chapter in the strange world. So it was actually a little awkward on such an occasion. The girl's body moved about. This was also one of the reasons why Li was unwilling to attend other people's banquets. She would look up from time to time, even if it was the old emperor's invitation. Even when she was about to rest, the lights were still on. That place is the Food Bureau, which is responsible for the meals in the Imperial Palace. The moment Wan Ruoqing opened her eyes, that can't be bought by the sunlight shining through the window. Li introduced covered her eyes with her hand and sat up on the bed with a trace of doubt on her face. And one could see she remembered coming in and out at every moment. To take a nap on the table. It was not easy to complete hundreds of banquets. How did she end up lying on the bed? To Yonghe Palace? Moreover, the sky was almost turning dark by the servants of the Imperial Palace. Why did it suddenly light up now? At the end of the road, when the two were about to enter Yonghe Palace, she laid on the table to the time she woke up on the bed, suddenly felt something. It seemed that only a quarter of an hour had passed. He raised his head and saw a pair of eyes looking at him from not far away. Her mind was still a little dazed. What a coincidence, Li Xianzi. Just as she was trying to make her mind again as soon as possible, Qin slowly walked over with a smile direction of the room door. Several young men followed behind him, wrapped in paper in his hand, and their expressions changed slightly. Seeing that Wan Ruoqing had woken up, he gestured to her and said, "I just bought these buns with cabbage fillings. Young Duke Qin was killed by Li Xianzi." They did not expect that they would meet again after only one day. Filled with amazement. It was really a case of enemies meeting each other. She was unable to come back to her happy face, as if he could not suppress the joy of meeting an old friend. Then I'll have one. He began to admire him a little. He was very clear on how long it would take for a person to wake up after. If it was a normal person, even if they didn't fight on the spot, when he came early in the morning, he such a completely opposite attitude. Wan Ruoqing also had a long time before appearing in front of Li again. I didn't expect that I would have such any makeup on, and her face was bare. Let alone she seemed to be in better spirits. Even the young men behind him couldn't help for a woman startled when someone who could meet her without makeup must have treated her as a true friend. And he had also made young Duke Qin suffer a lot. Although he could not tell what had changed on her before and after putting on makeup. Shouldn't one of them die? Sorry, how could it be related to fate? Cabbage buns. Madman Qin has already gone out to buy new ones. Just now, when Wan Ruoqing was washing up in the room, Xiao Zhu took a steamed bun and nibbled on it. When she realized that it was stuffed with cabbage, she told Li that Wan Ruoqing never ate steamed buns with this kind of stuffing. She then went out to buy breakfast again. Actually, Li did not like cabbage buns very much. Unfortunately, he had stayed up all night copying books and got up a little late in the morning. The bun shop had sold out the other fillings, so he had no other choice. Wan Ruoqing smiled and took a bite of a bun. After a while, she looked up at him and asked, when did you come back?" "Yesterday." Li wiped his hands and said, "I came here last night." You were asleep at the time, so I didn't wake you up. Wan Ruoqing somewhat regretted not insisting a little longer yesterday, but she quickly changed the topic and said, "The theater." Seeing that she was going to talk about the theater, Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Don't worry about the theater for now. Rest well in the next few days. I'll take care of those things." The things he did related to the theater were only because he did not want to see the brothel closed down at the time. He did not think about how big or how good it was. Although his thinking was different now, he could not make Ruoqing work so hard just because of this. Wan Ruoqing nibbled on the bun and did not know what to say for a moment. They had not seen each other for more than 2 months. She thought she would have a lot to say, such as asking how he was doing in the capital and if he would not come back in the future. However, when the words were on the tip of her tongue, she did not say them in the end. "I advise you to let it go. That person is having fun in the capital. Maybe he has long forgotten about the things here." Zheng Zumo walked in from outside with a food box in her hand. She would persuade Wan Ruoqing like this several times a day, but today she closed her mouth before she finished speaking. Looking at the back of the figure sitting across from Wan Ruoqing, a trace of doubt and disbelief quickly flashed through her eyes. A moment later, Li Yi took a sip of the porridge Zheng Zumo brought over with a spoon. He looked up at her and asked, "By the way, what did you say about having fun?" "Nothing." Seeing his indifferent look, Zheng Zumo gritted her teeth and said, "Where did you buy the porridge today?" Li Yi suddenly asked. "What?" Zheng Zumo turned to look at him, feeling a little nervous for no reason. "Don't go to that store in the future. You can't even control the heat of ordinary porridge. Sooner or later you will have to close. Eat it or leave it." Zheng Zumo snatched the bowl from Li Yi's hand, put it back in the food box and walked out angrily. "What's wrong with her?" Li Yi looked at Wan Ruoqing and asked in confusion. He did not offend her in any way today. Could it be that she was still holding a grudge over that misunderstanding? The first time they met was like this. Li Yi felt that the boat of friendship between the two might be overturned. Wan Ruoqing pondered for a moment and said, "Nothing. It's just that the porridge just now was made by Zumo herself." You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.